Hello, hello. We're live, by the way. Just making.
Yeah, I thought that might be the case. There we go. Okay.
Right.
Got it.
Hold on. Just, I never. All right.
My camera looks like it's flipped right now. Is it?
It's not flipped for me, but for people people are gonna see a different Daniel, a flipped Daniel.
Oh, yeah. See, that's a totally different Daniel.
All right, there you go. Can you guys hear Anarch pretty well, just to make sure? All right, a lot of people are thirsting for Anarch right now. All right, there you go.
Is that right? Okay, I'll take it.
Yeah.
I'll take it. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. People are saying they're here just for that, just to see Anarch.
What can I say?
Your camera.
I'm a sex symbol. What can I say?
All right, you said a bit loud. I'll lower the volume. All right. There you go. People were excited for this. I'm very happy to know that, we have an overlapping audience.
Yeah. When I told people I was coming on here, I had numerous people tell me they really liked your channel. And
wow.
These are people like in anarchist communities. So apparently you were already giving off the vibes well before you had your coming out of the closet moment.
coming out. Yeah, my coming out as an anarchist. Yeah,
right.
like I made some videos like as like leftist art, but never like, sometimes I would slide in that I'm anarchist, but I would never like come out until today. But I'm happy. I'm happy that that's the case. That's good. It's been, or maybe those people in anarchist communities are just very, very, perceptive.
Yeah, we're keyed in. We know how to recognize a crypto anarchist when we see one.
Yeah. All right. Well, so many people are already asking a lot of questions in chat from what I saw. Lenore asking a really good question, saying, I've got a question about anarchism. If there's no cops, who are supposed to throw bricks at during protests?
That's such a good point. That's such a good point. Wow. Yeah, I wouldn't want you to give up that hobby. That's, very cathartic.
All right. Well, all right. So I had so many topics that I wanted to bring up with you, because especially for your last two anarcho bridges, one with being more radical, or like not being radical, being extremist for the sake of being extremist, if I got it correctly.
Yeah. I don't remember. I think the title's like aesthetics as radicalism or something, but that's basically the idea, right? Yeah,
absolutely. And the also then listen liberals,
right?
Which was, and I might be wrong here, but I saw kind of an overlap between those two videos.
They're both kind of me having a stern talk with some group of people, aren't they? Yeah. Yeah. There's another one coming up. It'll be listen conservatives, and that's not a joke. That's true.
Yeah, no, I saw in the comments, listen conservatives. Is your approach, because that's the thing, like people were talking about in the comments. For example, for liberals, do you think that liberals will actually watch that video and be convinced by it? I think a question to ask is, what are liberals convinced by when it comes to?
Okay, will they? I guess that depends on the algorithm, right? I don't think there's a whole lot of liberals watching my channel. It would have to get pushed outside of my echo chamber, outside of my typical audience. So maybe we'll see. Like the thumbnail might drive some liberals to watch it. But will it actually convince them? I don't know. My experience with trying to kind of like shock liberals out of their typical perspective is that first they have to kind of lose faith in the system, because liberalism is based so much around this perspective that they are pragmatic, that they are the adults in the room, that they are the true utilitarians that are doing, what is needed in order to bring about a better society. That until they see that the system is incapable of doing what they think it can do, until they realize that more than even that it's just incapable of doing what they want, but that it's actually like formed to do the exact opposite of what they're wanting, that it's going to always kind of have some restoring force towards like an authoritarian or a fascistic sort of orientation. until they recognize that, they're very few of them are ever going to question themselves. So, a few people in the comments were kind of doubtful that the approach I had taken was going to convince them. And their reasoning was just that maybe I was a little bit too harsh. But the funny thing is, that was me really holding back. Okay, I was trying not to be mean in that video. I didn't want to be cruel, because that isn't going to really convince the liberal in my experience. Instead, I was trying to focus on just how the system functions as it does, and kind of hopefully plant that seed of doubt in the functioning of the system, so that perhaps they could consider ideas outside of the liberal framework. So will it convince them? I don't know. What does convince a liberal? Like I said, yeah, they have to be shocked out of this viewpoint that they're the adults in the room, that the system can work. So yeah, that's generally what's worked in my experience, which can be hard. It's kind of a slow process.
Yeah, and sometimes that's what I say, because when people challenge me in chat, and with either liberal answers or even conservative answers, I try to not, I know that my answer will never convince them. I don't think so. If someone writes in chat about, whatever, I know I'm not necessarily going to convince them, but I know that perhaps, just planting a seed of doubt can, in the long run, perhaps, if you say, hey, listen, liberals, the system is not going to fix this particular issue, because, for example, let's say homelessness, because it thrives on a homeless population. And if liberals are well, no, what are you talking about? And they brush you aside. But perhaps as they see that the homelessness crisis keeps, is not resolved, perhaps they weren't convinced by your argument, but it's a more of an accumulation, right, of experience and of ideas that they've encountered. So I don't think it's necessarily about convincing someone on the spot. If that's how you're going about it, I don't think you'll always you'll get very doomer very, 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 very quickly. But in terms of liberals, though, I think a lot of people come into anarchism as liberals. I don't know if you would agree with that.
I would say more come in through liberalism than through conservatism, but I've been surprised to find how many came through conservatism as well. Yeah,
I was more on hyper right, but I was very critical of it's there's there might be this criticism of liberalism that conservatives might have, or of more right-wing people might have, and they know that it's not the solution is not liberalism, so they might flip to anarchism, whatever. But the reason why I'm bringing up liberalism, and because Marxists will say that we're liberals, or and I know you'll have some things to say about that, that we're kind of liberals or rad libs, and there's some things about that, part of me, I don't know how to answer. Part of me is well, maybe we are, in the sense that, for example, Emma Goldman, when she went to the USSR, she was appalled by, I think it was a Soviet higher up saying that freedom of speech is just a bourgeois myth, right? And it's she's what the hell? And being against that might be a liberal tendency of her, it reflects into liberalism, right? But I don't know how bad that is. And Rudolf Rocker, which I know you love, also mentions that there's anarchism has its roots in, or his roots, or has taken inspiration from liberalism. So how would you answer to the Marxist that says you're a rad lib?
I don't think anarchism is really okay. So here, there's a lot of things I want to say, so it's hard to figure out where to start. I would say that Marxism and anarchism are just as much deriving from the liberal tradition as one another. I don't think that either of them is more or less connected to the liberal tradition, but that's because both of them sort of defined themselves explicitly in opposition to this sort of Enlightenment era representative politics, right? So kind of the ideas of all of these old Enlightenment thinkers, the liberal thinkers, as we sometimes call them, like John Locke, for example. This is he's one of the major ones. The left was a response to the failures of their ideological orientation. The belief of the liberals that in order to get all of the things they were claiming they wanted, these values of sort of like, freedom and self-determination and all of these conceptions of inherent human rights. The left wasn't necessarily coming in and saying, no, those things were, those weren't good things. We don't want those things. Instead, what they were saying was, you really just failed to bring about a society which, brought those things to fruition. The society that you advocated crushed all of those things, to the degree where, Marx himself, was an advocate for freedom. Marx was an advocate for these supposed bourgeois mythological rights. He just understood, as well as the anarchists, that capitalism and the liberal republic would never bring that about. And the thing is that they had they were less disdainful of the liberals than perhaps we are today. And maybe that's because they didn't have to dwell as long in their failures as we have now. But, they looked at the liberals and they were like, you just failed to bring about what you wanted to do. So we are creating this new tradition. And they didn't necessarily even think of it that way. Like, oh, here's our precipitous split with the liberals. But instead, they began writing in this new tradition. They began developing theory, developing critique of those thinkers and of the liberal capitalist republics which had arisen. But it should be said that they weren't so far separated that, Marx himself was not quoting, Adam Smith and Ricardo, who are considered the two founding fathers of capitalist economics. Marx directly was citing them in a way that wouldn't have even been controversial at the time. And also, liberals of the time were beginning to see some of these critiques themselves before you even had these criticisms being voiced by anarchists and early socialists, to the degree where Ricardo and Smith both kind of had some of these Marxist conceptions in them. Smith had a labor theory of value, which I won't go in too far on that just because that's kind of, theory dense. But Adam Smith had a labor theory of value. He did not have the subjective capitalist theory of value. And Ricardo supported worker cooperatives because he also had a labor theory of value. So what he was like, it sure seems like workers create all wealth. So the most rational way to organize this, if we're looking at, we're supposed to distribute money to the people who contribute the most, and ownership should be about who has, fertilized this property with their labor. It sure seems like everything should be worker cooperatives. And so you had even the late capitalists, or these, I guess early capitalists, however you want to see it, themselves starting to come across some of these socialistic arguments, which were then expanded by both anarchists and Marxists. But then to further complicate this, and I think this is why I was like, dang, where do you even start on all this? So the person who is generally considered like the founding father of anarchism is Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. And Proudhon was actually an influence to Marx. So Marx's critique of capital, a lot of his critique came from Proudhon. So then you're in the situation where it's like, well, if anarchists are rad libs, then what does that make Marx? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. I think for me personally, I would say, every era serves as a sort of evolution or refutation or response to the ideas of the previous era. The thinkers who came before, the people who set the stage, and the liberals had set the stage of that era. From the results of the Enlightenment and the expansion of capitalism across the planet at that point. And so they were a mixture of, this is true for the anarchists, the Marxists, and all the others. They were a mixture of trying to fulfill old liberal ideas and breaking with liberalism. So I personally I view anarchists and Marxists and the rest of the socialist milieu as having been a break with liberalism for that reason. That's my personal opinion. But as you say, numerous anarchists will make note that liberal philosophers were influential to the anarchists. Many of them very influential.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like for example, like I think the ideals of liberalism, like the equality and liberty, is ideals that no Marxist or anarchist can be against. It's just like maybe how to get there. It's interesting because I'm actually doing research for a video on Adam Smith, and I'm interviewing perhaps next week a scholar who wrote an article on how Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is supposed to be his magnum opus on capitalism, right? The founding text of capitalism was a rejection of the previous economic system, which was like mercantilism. And he writes at length about mercantilism, but the reason why he's advocating for free markets is because the markets at that time were monopolized by a small group of individuals who were in tandem with the government. So his whole idea is that the government right now is working for the benefit of this small, like this handful of people who get to monopolize the economy and can do whatever they want with it, which is restricting people's freedoms in a way. There's like, it's not to say that like Adam Smith was like a great leftist and all that, but there like. To put it in context, he wasn't evil. He wasn't evil in advocating for free markets. He was actually rejecting like a previous system that was like contributing to the concentration of power within the hands of a few. And like what we're seeing is that the free markets, well, actually they're doing the same. But how could he have known in the 1700s? And the whole idea is that if we can read Wealth of Nations in that context, perhaps we can actually develop a critical eye of capitalism, because it's basically doing the same thing as mercantilism is doing back then, right? And like also liberals at that time were radicals, were extremely radical, as you said. Maybe less now, because now it's the what everybody, I think a majority of the population is. Would you say that, because you said it's easier to take a liberal and make him and convince him into anarchism, but would you say that, for example, like is like your next video, and I don't want to spoil your next video for everyone about listen conservatives, right? But for your next video on for conservatives, will you be more rough? Will you be, what are you're going to be like, you're talking, what do you think is good points to talk anarchism with a conservative?
Well, okay. So just as kind of on the, I don't know what Democrat voting liberals, I'm using a United States context here. Yeah. You've got a few different kinds of people in that coalition, right? Well, the conservatives also have a few different kinds of people in their coalition, right? So they have people that are more like ANCAPs, or what we might call like American libertarians, where, they want the state to be so small they can drown it in the bathtub, as it was famously said. And then you've got just like outright fascists, people who just want the state to be as powerful as possible, to create a national unity, extreme militaristic tendencies, the desire to dominate the globe and to create normalization and to police the boundaries with violence and all of that. Those people are not candidates for conversion. I mean, on a long enough timeline, who knows what could happen, but they are not a target audience for propaganda, right? But the ones who are kind of like these naive, like, don't tread on me, not in my backyard, like these sorts of people, I mean, I make fun of them with what I just said, but they're actually a lot more, possible to move over to an anarchist or really any radical left perspective, because they at least kind of have some fundamental underlying understanding that they don't like people intervening in their lives and restricting their freedom, right? They just have no understanding of what a world would look like which encouraged their freedom. They think that a world that encouraged their freedom would just be them like living in a shack in the middle of nowhere and no one bothers them. They have what you might call a negative conception of freedom. Freedom means don't tread on me. Whereas the anarchist conception of freedom is a positive conception of freedom. What are you actually able to do? What are the array of things that you are able to do? In what way are your powers embodied really in the world? And when you ask that question, what is a positive freedom? How do you bring about a positive freedom? You see that is embodied in community and solidarity and building structures of cooperation with one another. In which case, that is really the big thing. That's the big hurdle that you have to overcome with the conservative. You are not stronger when you are isolated. You are stronger when you are bound together with a community. You are stronger when you do not seek, that you are not aggrieved with people who are different, that you try to find out what the unifying factors are between you and them. Now, part of the reason why we're so bad at reaching out to them, there's a bunch of reasons, but one of them is just that, unfortunately, the left is very much concentrated in the urban centers, and there's this sort of like urban chauvinism that takes place within a lot of left communities, where they think that everybody in the rural areas are violent, bigoted rednecks who just want to, that they're like the fascists, basically, and that every one of those kind of ANCAP, don't tread on me types is completely unsavable, and that that whole part of the world is dangerous, and so on and so on, right? These are impediments to being able to reach out to these people, to communicate with them, and to convey to them a vision of how anarchism, for example, is actually within their best interests. But here's what I'll say. It's a different kind of path than convincing the liberal. I guess I'll just say ANCAP or libertarian. I'll just use that word. People are probably more familiar with it. Convincing the libertarian is nothing like convincing the liberal. The libertarian already knows the system is failing. Yeah. Okay. They already know the state sucks. They often even kind of hate the big corporations. I mean, especially as these rural areas are becoming more and more pervaded by huge companies like Monsanto and stuff. Now, they weirdly still revere all of these key figures, the top, like the CEOs and everything. But what you have to do with them is you have to help them understand that capitalism is also an exploitative force. That the misery, the poverty of the places they live is because capitalism and the state work together, and that capitalism without the state would just recreate the state. That the problem is that people keep wanting to build systems that rank people one above another, and that when you are agent in that, you are helping them exploit you. So that's part of the messaging that has to happen. And I've actually been shocked with how well that kind of rhetoric can connect directly to a lot of people who kind of have that more, I guess you'd say, American libertarian perspective. So I don't know. Is that an answer to the question?
I actually really agree. I feel like the between liberals and conservatives, that's like the, and when you say conservatives, I agree with you, like in the sense that it's more libertarian. I think liberals, it's saying, yeah, the system is failing. Like we share the same goals. I think someone in chat said, hey, anarchism doesn't sound as radical because like the goals are basically the goals that we strive for today. It's just saying that it's they had a difficulty seeing it applied, and maybe we can come back to that later. They wanted examples and stuff like that. But yeah, it's like the value's already there. It's great. For conservatives, well, I do think conservatives also want community. And and there's like this value of community, the church. I don't know how religious you are, but like the church is like, their center, like the community, and it's very valuable, not only for the religious like element to it, but the community element to it. And they're very, at least like, we're painting with broad strokes here, but a lot of conservatives are very often very socially aware, in the sense of like, conforming to, dress codes, for example, just like conforming to social norms. There's this idea of community that I believe is really strong in conservatives, and even the libertarian types. And I do believe, and that's that's a speech that I've given chat like 5 times perhaps, but saying like, if you understand the authority of the government, like the authority of the boss should be so much more easily understandable. Like your boss has so much more say in your life and how to live your life than the government does. The government does have a say in your life, but your boss can tell you what to wear. Like 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, can tell you what to wear, can tell you when to smile, can tell you when, like what exact words you must say, depending, like if you work, I worked mostly in retail. So it's like, all right, you got to wear this. You got to smile. You got to smile a bit more, right? Like you don't want people to think that you're not happy here. Oh, you got to say these words. All right, you got to talk about this promotion. And it's like, this person is your personal dictator, right? 40 hours a day, 50 some, depending on how many weeks of vacation you have, a year, and perhaps for the next 40 years will be your personal dictator. And you're afraid of the authority of the state. Some employers will look at like what you post on social media to make sure like that you're not like, I don't know. Anyway, all of that to say, like, I'm much more afraid of the authority of the boss than the authority of the state. And I feel like conveying that, it's not a fear, but conveying that is for the conservative, I believe, is the most, just showing like, yeah, there's authority there, but a lot of people see it as normal. But I think just pushing that, saying it isn't normal, it doesn't have to be normalized, at least for conservatives. I'm a very big fan of I think conservatives can be allies. I don't know if you're as positive as I am. I think sometimes like even conservatives might be better than liberals in that sense.
So you face different problems, right? So the thing is that if you can convince dang. Okay. Once again, like where do I start? So I'll just start by saying, if you convince the liberal, you've still got all of this annoying stuff where they're probably going to go through a phase where they're just like a social democrat and they're like going to become a Bernie progressive. And then maybe even after that, they're going to become some kind of statist, and maybe they'll like want like state socialism and nationalization of industry. And then, like there's sometimes a long path in that. With conservatives, they might get straight to this sort of like, yeah, screw the government, screw the workplace, but I still hate black people, but I still do think women should, cover up and do what men say, like I still do hate the gays, like that's the problem is you have all these like ingrained bigotries. And that's of course not to say that every single person who just like votes Republican is like a bigot. I've met people that aren't, or don't get me wrong, voting Republican is a pretty bigoted thing to do, but like they're not interpersonally cruel to those kinds of people. But I'm sad to say it, that's a pretty uncommon affair. Most of the time they've got one or another of these kind of bigoted viewpoints, and those can be really hard to root out and get rid of. And it's not to say that it's not possible by any means, like it totally is possible. But that's the struggle you face, right? The liberals going to cling to systems of power for a lot longer, but they'll probably not hate people that are different, that have different identities from them. Yeah. They'll value, multiculturalism and so on. Whereas the conservative might be way faster to side against systems of power, but they're like, first of all, they're not even going to notice that like white supremacy is a power structure, right? Yeah. Patriarchy is a power structure. Like these things have structures behind them, and that's one of the hard parts for them. That is not nearly as legible to them a lot of the time. And getting through that and also confronting their own interpersonal biases can often be one of the big challenges. So I actually, the way I look at it is there's challenges for both. I think that maybe we should I don't think we should stop trying to convince liberals, but I do think that we should stop pretending that it's only liberals that we could convince. And once again, I'll just make the note, like, if they're just full on fascists, I mean, they've just given in to like, I will march lockstep in a war to kill other kinds of people, right? Like there's on a long enough timeline, they might come around, and that totally does happen, especially if they do it when they're young. But like, if you're talking to a 40-year-old man that has like a swastika tattoo, that's not your target audience, right?
That's a bit more rough. Yeah, I do think a lot of young people might be memeing that way. Like my personal experience is I was not that I was memeing that way, but I was consuming content that way when I was through YouTube, and I feel like it very often it's not necessarily like an ardent like I will tattoo it on my shoulder, but it's more like of a casual kind of I watched that streamer or I watched that content creator, and I agree with him, but like without the necessarily the necessary engagement to tattoo it, right? But like to go back to like the conservatives like who are bigoted, like to root it out, it is rough, but I do think a good way to root it out is because it's in terms of proximity, it can help. For example, I hated feminists, these those pesky feminists that like YouTube told me to hate, and it's only through anarchism. Or through getting through anarchist circles, and I was an anarchist, and I was an anti-feminist anarchist, believe it or not. The transition didn't transition didn't go as over a day, right? But it's through like proximity, because very often, when you're bigoted, you have a mental picture of the other that is completely skewed from reality. To me, like the feminists are the red hair, and they scream at you, and a lot of people right now, I see it for trans people, it's like, oh, if you mispronounce them, if you use the wrong pronouns, they will yell at you, and they'll get really angry and all that, and it's most of the time it's not the case. Like people will just say like, oh, just my pronouns are actually this. And that like it'll end there. And I think proximity can help. And it's true. Like, for example, for me, it helped. And I want to segue that into the rural dichotomy, because I live in rural Quebec, and it's been a huge clash. And I've realized, for example, when it comes to criticizing systems of power, people are not that, they don't have the conditions aren't as ripe to criticize, and I don't know how to bring them to that criticism. And maybe you can answer that. Because I know Tulsa is a city, right? Where's in which state is Tulsa? I think it's more of a
it's in the state of Oklahoma,
which I feel like is more like it's rural
much
state,
more rural,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
Tulsa is not rural. Tulsa is a major metropolitan city, but it is a much more rural state in a general sense.
You do have a bike behind you, right? So that means that you're more in the urban center. But like,
yes.
I just want to tell you like the conditions. Like, for example, try to criticize cops here is impossible, because everybody know the names of the cops, and they're actually nice people. If you're not like doing crime, and also since there's no protest, it's really hard to see the political function of the police. When you go to a protest, the political function of the police is in your face. Sometimes quite literally, like in your eyes or in your lungs. But in the rural areas, the political function of the police is going to be it's going to be less apparent. And same thing for capitalists. Very often, at least depending on how rural you are, here it's pretty rural, everybody knows their boss.
Yeah.
And some people,
like, what do you mean to kill all the store owners? Joe's a great guy. I mean, his hardware store is fantastic.
So the same way, all right, I don't want to put an equivalency here, but like the same way, like, for example, proximity to marginalized people will make you understand and like actually be more willing to like, to listen to them. There's also a proximity to systems of power.
Yes.
I don't know if it's proximity is the right word, but that makes you more it makes them more personalized in a way. I don't know. Like how would you go about someone who says, I know my, like, the bosses here are amazing. The cops, I know them by their names. They help bring the groceries of my grandma in the house or whatever, those kinds of things. And it's true. They do that. Right. And they how do you confront that?
Well, okay. So there's a few things I would say. If I were just like directly answering the last question, I would probably start with less invective, negative rhetoric, which is to say, spend less time talking about how much you hate the capitalists and the cops and the state. Spend more time talking about the way you think things should be. And that is to say, I found that a very good vector for discussion that pretty much just works with anyone and everyone, and it's a very safe vector for discussion, is when you start talking about the workplace, don't talk about how much you hate the boss. Talk about basically that it should be a worker cooperative, right? Basically, like, you don't have to call it a worker cooperative, but just explain the vision of a worker cooperative to them. Do you really think X should have been making that decision? I mean, it kind of seems like all of us should be making a little more wages. I wish we just all had control over our workplace. Wouldn't it be great if, as we worked, we all got a stake in the workplace, and like, we had like we got profits as we provided more labor and that kind of thing. And, some people are going to be like hardline in defending the capitalist perspective about private property. And, that'll be a more difficult discussion, but I think you'll be shocked how many people are like, yeah, that would be ideal. That would be the better way to do it. You can kind of introduce them to some of the fundamental conceptions of, like, to each the product of their labor kind of thing. Right. And it kind of guides them in gently. But one thing I want to say is that when I look at the political conditions of Canada, and I talk to people that are in Canada, it really reminds me of what the US was like before Occupy. So when I look at what Occupy did for the United States, it was that, there were numerous things here. One was, as you said, it provided a situation where you were being confronted with the political nature of all of these power structures. That when the cop is out there and it's beating somebody that because you've been organizing with them, or they're pepper spraying you, or whatever it is, and all you're trying to do is protest like an inequity in society, something that absolutely should be changed, that is an extremely radicalizing event. And as more and more people see it, it's actually more radicalizing for them by proxy as well. Some people are going to go, you deserved it, you shouldn't have done illegal protest. But some people are going to see it and be like, yo, I agree with what they're saying. I can't believe they're beating them with riot batons. That's screwed up. Like that is a radicalizing process. Furthermore, a mass movement like Occupy popularized more radical rhetoric. So it created this language of the 99% versus the 1%. Previous to that, that was just language being used by Howard Zinn in A People's History of the United States. And that popularization of that rhetoric got people, it created a sort of embryonic class consciousness that there are many, many, many of us, and there are very, very few of them. Why do they have all the power? How does that make any sense? And that was another one of those aspects. So what I would say in a general sense is that if I were trying to convince people in rural areas that capitalism is bad and I were to be using negative rhetoric, I wouldn't be focusing on all kinds of businesses. The conversation will end up there at some point because it'll bring up small businesses. But I would focus on like the mega conglomerates that I imagine are buying up huge plots of land in the rural area that you're in. Mm-hmm. The huge farming companies that are monopolizing all of the supply chains, and where, you like that, that farmer down the street you think runs a good small farm, and you hate how you heard that Tyson just bought up his entire operation. Well, maybe have a conversation about Tyson, and that's just an example here in the United States, Tyson, Monsanto, and they're buying up.
Who's Tyson? And why does
Tyson is
Tyson so much?
It's a food manufacturer. They're a food producer, and mostly they're known for producing chicken. So they buy up a lot of chicken farms here.
All right. It's not just a random guy that anarchist has.
No. Tyson's the name of a really big company. Yeah. But I imagine, unless you're in a very untouched area of rural life, that the big companies, big entities are starting to buy up large portions of land, are starting to buy up, small farms, or if not buying them, then, demanding certain things of their labor practices and so on. And as that happens, you'll find even rural people start to recognize the evils of capitalism. They start to be like, sure seems like when these companies get big, it's bad.
Yeah.
Or for example, here in the United States, we have lots of Walmarts in rural areas. So people have kind of a mixed relationship with those Walmarts in those rural areas. Those Walmarts are often the only business in town that provides any jobs. And so they're kind of like grateful a little bit, but also in order for that Walmart to have come in, it had to destroy all of their small businesses.
Yeah.
So then they also kind of have like this like cultural resentment, right? And they are subjected to the labor practices of an enormous mega corporation, as opposed to Joe down the street who runs a hardware store. So that's what I would say. Focus more on a positive vision, focused on the biggest bad players. And in a general sense, probably Canada's political culture is not going to turn until you have a big protest movement that is focused on class consciousness.
Yeah, but like our protest movements usually mirror your own, so like we're just waiting on you guys. That's all.
Damn.
All we're waiting
okay.
for.
Wow.
Yeah. All our faith is in you. But yeah, like for example, I'm in a very, very isolated. There's no farms here. The closest Walmart is like 6 hours away. So there's not these big corporations. But I do think like you can still have that rhetoric of positive. Like, what do you think about like using capitalist goals or capitalist rhetoric to, for example, I'll give you this. I convinced my brother. I shouldn't have said my brother. Someone in my family who's like very capitalist, right? Who's like extremely capitalist, but like, and telling him like, yeah, cooperatives can be actually pretty good. And like how I did it is using more capitalist minded goals, in the sense that like, all right now one of the struggles we don't have big corporations taking things up, but what we do have is a labor shortage, a really strong one, because like all the young people, because there's no corporations here, they all leave for the city to get jobs, and here there's none. And aside from like some YouTuber somewhere in one of the houses apparently, but aside from that, it's all people who are retired. So when it comes to like, the grocery store or the hardware store and all that, they have a very like a shortage of labor. And how do you deal with that when it's a really hard thing to deal with? And I told him an example of things that you can do is worker cooperatives is going to develop a loyalty and is going to develop an incentive for people to work for that store, right? And it will be an incentive not only to work there, but to stay there and be more involved and be more productive. And though, yes, it's true, it's still capitalist-minded goals, right? It's just like saying it'll be more effective. It's like a better form of capitalism. It'll be the the worker-owned co-ops are the ones that are, workers are more dedicated to their work to make the business go the line go up in the business. So I don't know, like how do you think that there might be a harm in the long run with that rhetoric, or maybe perhaps we're not even there and thinking about it?
I think
we're so far away from the goal.
I think that the way I look at it is this: if you can convince people of those sort of like preliminary points, it's going to be way easier down the line to then kind of push it out a little bit. So you start with this, as you say, some sort of rhetoric about worker cooperatives are more productive, and they actually are, by the way. They actually are more productive by scale. That's what studies show. And you can start there, and then to a capitalist, that's appealing. Oh, they're more productive. I like productivity. I think productivity is good. But the underlying point that they're really accepting is cooperation is more powerful than hierarchical control, right? That actually horizontalizing these systems does the good things you just noted, right? And then they can, over time, perhaps internalize that the real goal here is actually that horizontalizing. That's actually the good thing we're trying to do. Productivity is just an outcome, but cooperation is the real goal. And so I think that's really more what people will tend to internalize there. And I'll also say this. If all they do is radicalize and become like a mutualist or something, and that's the furthest they go, it's way better that they're like a mutualist than a capitalist. You know what I'm saying? Like, so yeah, no, I think those are good approaches. You meet people where they're at, and you ask yourself, how far can you pull them towards a more liberatory ideology? And you don't try to pull them further than you know that you're going to be able to. You pull them as far as you think you're going to be able to. You try to plant seeds that hopefully as they grow will produce cracks in the edifice of their previous thinking. So that's the way to approach it. I do have a question though. I mean, how are people being employed where you're at?
Right now, at least for right now, the businesses are having a lot of issues because of that. Wages are going up because of the power dynamics now. Wages are going up in bigger factories because I live. It's more of a maritime kind of place. Actually, there's a new phenomena going on here is that there are hiring workers from the south, flying them here and giving them work for 3 months and then flying them out. And it's been an interesting conversation with people to talk about that, talk about consent in within capitalist relations. It's a lot harder because it's either Mexicans or people from Guatemala, at least the ones I've encountered. And my partner speaks Spanish. I don't, but we can actually have discussions with them. But they're working 12 hours a day, six days a week, usually minimum wage. Their plane ticket is paid and their lodging is paid. And a lot of people are like, oh, we're doing them such a great service because they're not making any money in the South, so we're really helping them out here. And but at the same time, it's easy also to tell people conditions are not that great. Well, there's a reason why nobody wants to do that job, these jobs here, right? And I'm sure there's work to be done, and there's potential there to say, don't you see that what we're doing is the jobs that we don't like, we're just relegating it to people who don't have the means to say no. And there's something kind of perverse and kind of bad and saying that we are helping them out by giving them the jobs that we don't want to do there's kind of something that's but it's hard because we're not a very socially, at least the people that around me are not super socially aware, but it is a situation that can lead to conversations, right, about the ethics of employment or the consent employment within. And I know I'm sure in Oklahoma you also have that, except that they're not. And that's another thing. They'll say, well, they're housed, they're flown here, and it's regulated. It's not like in the United States where they work under minimum wage, and it's they'll use that to compare and justify their conditions here. But it's and I was about to say you can actually also say they're unionized, these workers, but they don't want to say anything because they're afraid of being sent back home. If they're sent back home, that's a lot of money that or a lot of potential money that they're losing. And sometimes I use that rhetoric of it sucks for them because they can't speak up a word, and that's to the advantage of the bosses. I don't know if they're actually if they're being unfairly treated compared to the local workers. But one thing I do know for sure is they can't speak up. They don't even speak French anyway, so that does harm the process as well.
So you said they are unionized, though?
They are unionized. I don't know how effective the union is with foreign workers. Just the language barrier in itself is something that hurts. The fact that they're not permanent, the fact that they're there for like sometimes 2 or 3 months only, might hurt as well. But even if they are unionized, they don't. From what when I've spoke to them, or when I spoke to them through my partner, they told me like, oh yeah, no, we don't want them to be angry. We don't want the bosses to be angry at us, which is completely understandable. You know, they're making like, they're like, yeah, we can work 3 or 4 months and like we're good for the rest of the year at home. So we do not want to, like, even if we finish the contract, we want to be called back next year, which is understandable. Like their situation is very understandable, and I won't be like, guys, you need to rise up. Come on. They're afraid of losing they're afraid of losing that opportunity. So, but in terms of rhetoric, it's been like, it's a situation that, you know, that is conducive to sympathy from people. Because in this rural area, at least, there's not that much interpersonal. There's like, of course, there's how do you call it? Micro
aggressions.
Like the microaggressions. But people, at least we're such an isolated country, or isolated like area, that people will see like people come from other countries as something, for better or for worse, exotic and like actually like cool. Which is why it comes with microaggressions. Like, oh, where are you from? Where are you actually from? So it was like these kinds of things. But aside from that, there's no, at least from I feel like I'm aware of that. Like, there's no hate crimes, and people are usually they're very happy when, because Mexicans all come, like they're like, there's like 20 of them workers. They go to grocery stores, they go to local, you know, local places, and they buy a lot of either food for the week, or, you know, so they're contributing to the economy, which people are usually grateful for. And there's, at least in that part, it's easy to get sympathy, because a lot of them have like pity them in a way, which can also comes with its, you know, there's good and bads from that. But anyway, where was I going? I was going to ask you that question. Yeah, how would you, in that context, instrumentalize that situation to bring class awareness in a way?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're in a situation where it's going to be a lot more challenging, and that's mostly just because you don't have a lot of abusive hierarchies that are taking place there. Obviously, there are those that you know, we've discussed, and those are prevalent, but they're normalized for a lot of people. What you have to do is you have to find the place that the sticking point that produces displeasure. That's the place where people feel misery based on their conditions. I guess another one I would ask is like, is there ecological destruction that's taking place nearby?
That's another thing. Yeah, there is this factory, but it's not populated enough. I know that like some forests are being cut down, but they're doing it in the back of my area. You don't see it. You don't even hear of it. But in terms of, this is probably the best angle given what you've told me so far. I mean, obviously the factory probably sucks. I mean, there's probably no factory that doesn't suck, right? Yeah.
But are you telling me there's also logging taking place?
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, so that's if I were in that area, I would probably take a more kind of ecological approach. I would probably be focusing on those issues, be focusing on how the logging is going to destroy the natural environment. People in rural areas typically have a lot more appreciation for the natural world because they're kind of surrounded by the natural world more often. Exposing people to what is happening on that front is probably a very good way to go. And linking it to a broader ecological struggle may be very important. So, one thing that, one of the organizations I'm part of here, Scissortail, we talked about how there are different fronts, and the different fronts you want to approach the people in those areas differently. So Here in Oklahoma, the rural front, we decided that the best rhetoric was going to be based around Christian anarchism because of the church, as you said, and social ecology or eco-anarchism, you might say, right? And it's for the first reason you said, which is that the church is almost always going to be a center of community in rural areas. And coming into those areas and being like, I'm an atheist or something, that's just never going to work out.
No God, no masters.
Yeah. No God, no masters is not a tagline that was developed for rural areas, I got to tell you. So probably introducing them like Leo Tolstoy or some kind of Christian anarchism might be a good start. And also some form of eco-anarchism or social ecology. In fact, in that sort of context, you may be best off calling yourself a social ecologist or introducing them to like Murray Bookchin or talking about Rojava, or linking it to indigenous struggles and the destruction of the Amazon, and helping people see how this ecological destruction is going to ruin the environment that they're embedded in. And it's true. That is the ultimate outcome of all of this, right? Is that because I imagine it's probably beautiful. I haven't been there, but I'm just guessing that it is. Sounds like it's mostly unspoiled wilderness.
Yeah, it is.
And so probably people don't want that to be destroyed. And that stuff that they're not seeing, you should probably somehow find a way to make them see that. Yeah. Somehow bring that to the fore.
That's an interesting thing as well, that you because you've mentioned like join your anarchist organizations, and I feel like a lot of people would. What would you say to people who are in either more conservative areas or like even conservative areas will have anarchist organizations? I imagine Tulsa, like Oklahoma is probably not a very like socialist leaning place, but like maybe Tulsa is because it's more urban, but like in general Oklahoma, yeah,
still conservative overall.
Yeah, I can imagine. But you will always find organizations that are more left leaning just because of the sheer amount of population. But what about places where population sizes are extremely like small?
Are small.
Yeah.
Like the truth is that every time I have to talk to somebody who's living in a rural area, I have to tell them, it's like, it sounds like you've got a responsibility to do some work yourself, like you probably are going to have to be the one to get this ball rolling. And it doesn't mean that you'll always be the one doing it yourself, but it's very likely that you're going to have to get it started. If you're asking me this question and there's no organization in your area and you're the only anarchist well, sounds like you've got some work cut out for you. You better get started creating more anarchists, or at least, trying to bring people to the fore to struggle in a way which is conducive to, reducing hierarchical power in the area and reminding people of their fundamental dignity and worthiness to control the world around them. And I think that the ecological struggle is one of those that the longer we go with climate change as it is, that struggle is going to become more and more and more at the forefront. Murray Bookchin says that is the key struggle of our time, because we've despoiled the planet so thoroughly that now people across all lines, across all class lines, gender, race, nationality, are experiencing the destruction of the environment, and it's becoming, in the language of the Marxists, a primary contradiction. It pervades everywhere, and pretty much no matter what environment you're in, the environment's being wrecked. So it also links you in with a bigger struggle. And in a sense, you can take a lighter title as well. You could call yourself like a communalist or something, or a social ecologist, not nearly as scary as the word anarchist. But, I would say starting to hand out information, create either flyers or print zines, which are very easy to do. And then table those in at public areas, or when there are big get-togethers, provide that information to people. Maybe start a little reading group and try to advertise it in your local area. One thing I've often said to people is that even in small areas, even in like exurban or rural areas, you may not be the only anarchist. You may not be the only left radical in your area. In fact, it's funny because I have a friend who lives in a little town about an hour from where I'm at, which is kind of ex-urban, almost rural, and it's called Bartlesville. And he's an anarchist, and he has been since I've known him for a very long time. And he didn't think there were any other ones there. And I was like, well, okay, and kind of gave him some of the similar advice. But then out of nowhere, somebody contacts us on Scissortail's Instagram DMs, and there are 3 of them there in Bartlesville, and they're all anarchists. And they say, I don't know of any other anarchists in Bartlesville. And it's like this. You usually just don't know what kind of people are surrounding you, right? You just like, even in small towns, you've only got 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people. You may have other radicals there who are thinking the same thing as you. Like, oh, I'm the only one for 50 miles. It's like, well, no, just people just don't say it in polite conversation. It's not like everybody's going around being like, oh, there's the town anarchist, So I would say establishing a place where those people can meet and where people can have be educated with a radical perspective, where they can learn more. That's one of the big keys in starting this all.
Yeah, I do. It's something that I've been advocating for a lot, is at least like a physical space can often very much help. And can be less intimidating, like a public space obviously can be less intimidating for people to gather and maybe like go to it. Like could be a cafe, and like historically this is like like cafes and like public spaces have been really conducive to like not only like be a good meeting ground for people to like just exchange, but also like to anchor your movement, or not your movement, but like in that case like your group into the community, in like make it material, not just like we're just a bunch of people, like we're actually meeting at this place, and it allows people to join. And maybe in that case, I don't know if anarchist is the right, because some people will like, some business owners will say, yeah, we're not having a anarchist organize, especially in small towns. That's kind of scary for a lot of people, but like social ecologists can be a good way. And maybe at least that's been my experience. Like you will have to encounter and meet with and work with a lot of socially minded liberals, who are liberals because of more like because that's like the only option out there. It's the only how do you adult option, as you say. But I don't think that necessarily means that they can't help work with you, and that working with you won't actually radicalize them either. It can be a good thing. And also another thing I would say is put your hopes down, because if you think you will gather people and cease the means of productions in what's it called, Bertleville. It's not
Bertleville. Sorry. It was Bartlesville, but I think I actually like Bertleville, so I'm gonna really? Tell him that's what I'm gonna call it.
Exactly. Now.
Bertleville.
But you might like, that's the thing. Like at least here, sometimes it's really easy to like get burnt out or get very discouraged from people's conservatism, and I think really focus on positive wins, or at least just the fact that you've met people, because it can be very hard, and can be the amount of times that my partner and I were like, let's get out of this place, let's get out of here, we can't do anything with with people here. And it's like the median age here is 56, so it's like a very older population. So even then, when you're talking about them, about capitalism and all that, it's like, oh, that's really cool. Well, that's good for you guys. Keep doing whatever. Like, we love seeing young people in politics. Keep doing it. Don't forget to vote. That's the kind of the kind of things we get. Well, I mean, as long as they're not throwing rocks at us, I guess that's a good thing. But yeah, I think like reduce your expectations, because else activist burnout, and like it might toil on your mental health as well
Yeah,
At least
plan at your capacity. That's what don't plan for beyond your capacity. Plan at your capacity. Part of the reason why I would suggest like printing zines or doing a reading group is literally one person can do that, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Don't go out organizing marches and protests. You'll be very.
You've got like 150 people in your town, and you're trying to get a march together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you have 150 people, if you're alone, it's already like almost a percent, like 1%, right? So it's like.
Oh yeah.
Right?
So that's actually a very anarchist town.
Yeah, exactly. More anarchists than most towns. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how long you have. Because I want to ask as well, like how you became an anarchist, but like you've said it
around for a little while.
Yeah, amazing. Because I want to know how you became an anarchist, but not because like most people who know you already know, because I've heard you repeat it so many times through interviews and stuff like that. But what lessons can we get from your radicalization to help people? Because I feel like that's a good way of knowing how to, the different ways. For me, it was like I've made a video. I said it is mostly books. Like I was isolated, and it's through books that I got into it. But I know it's not the case for everyone, and accumulating those experiences from talking to people and all that can inform ways of doing it, and also it images the variety in which that radicalization can take place. So tell us your story. What got you here?
Every time I tell the story, I tell it a little bit different. So this time, what I'll note, I mean, given the context of our discussion, is that I started on that liberal side of things, right? So that's not to say that I didn't have any kind of reactionary or bigoted opinions, but in a general sense, I was kind of more culturally progressive, and definitely thought I was the adult in the room because I voted Democrat. And, I kind of just had this perspective like Republicans bad, that was my worldview. And, Iraq war equals bad. Which of course I was right about that. I mean, Iraq war equals bad, but I had this viewpoint that, you should work inside the system, that our failure is because people just aren't working well enough inside of the system. We just need to get people to work inside the system better. We need to vote better. We need to pass better laws, and so on and so on and so on. So that was kind of my, position before becoming an anarchist. And for me, a big part of my change in thinking was the 2008 financial crisis. I know that the more years go on, this the meaning of the 2008 financial crisis it diminishes as more and more people are born and have no idea what happened in the 2008. But in 2008, there was a global financial collapse where the global economy didn't fully collapse, but in a bunch of countries, it did. And that was due to the United States and the way that we had arranged our financial system. And it was largely due to the enormous banks and credit agencies lobbying our government until they deregulated them, and then blowing up the whole economy a few decades later. And for me, that was that was a shock to the system. And I think one of the big parts of it, I watched a very important event was this documentary called Inside Job, which I would recommend to anybody here on stream. If you're interested in what happened with the 2008 financial crisis, you should watch the documentary Inside Job, which is really good, still stands up really well. But what I learned in Inside Job is that the deregulation that allowed the 2008 financial crisis to take place happened under Bill Clinton. And that was very confusing for a vote Democrat liberal, right? I was looking around and everything was screwed up, and the economy was crashing, and my dad's pension was getting cut. And the fact that a Democratic president did that, I mean, it just kind of put a crack in that edifice, as we had said, well, now I kind of feel doubt. It's like, is just voting Democrat good enough? I mean, I still vote Democrat, but oh man, it's bigger than that. Wow. There's something something at play behind the scenes here, something bigger than the two parties. Seems like both parties are complicit. And then in 2011 came Occupy Wall Street. Well, by the time that had come around, I was already moving towards a more radical perspective. When I was young, I was like a little more skeptical of the system than most. But as I said, as I just kind of recounted, I still was a vote Democrat liberal sort of. But by the time 2011 came around, between 2008 and 2011, I had started to kind of have some really significant questions. And I was probably, I would say, something more like a social democrat by that point. Which for people here on stream that maybe aren't familiar, a social democrat would be like, Sweden or Netherlands or Switzerland or something. We want lots of really great welfare programs, regulations on corporations, and so on. So I was kind of around to that by that point. So then during the Occupy Wall Street, I began learning about all these different ideologies: socialism, communism, anarchism. I learned about Karl Marx. That's actually where I got my earliest education on leftism, learned about Karl Marx during Occupy. But I also started listening to Noam Chomsky, and I read A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And this introduced the word anarchism, or introduced the real meaning of anarchism into my language. Specifically, I became interested in anarcho-syndicalism, and that actually lasted a long time. I actually continued calling myself an anarcho-syndicalist until relatively recently, maybe only a few years ago. And then I got interested in Rudolf Rocker. And through this period of time, I still wasn't maybe always calling myself an anarchist. I probably started to call myself I was starting to call myself like a socialist or a progressive, right? But I also started kind of being more specific with people who were interested in saying, I'm an anarcho-syndicalist. Now, I'll say now, looking back, I don't think I really fully understood what an anarcho-syndicalist was and what that entailed. But Noam Chomsky was an anarcho-syndicalist. Rudolf Rocker was an anarcho-syndicalist. And I started to become just kind of more interested, generally about what anarchism is and learning more about anarcho-syndicalism. And I would say I kind of persisted in something very similar to this until just around maybe 2015 or so, around the time Bernie was coming on the scene. And then I started getting into lots of arguments online. And it became necessary that I actually started kind of educating myself and actually knowing what I was talking about beyond knowing like the Karl Marx. Like I was like, I knew mostly Marxism, but I knew a little bit of anarchism and anarcho-syndicalism. I was like, okay, cool. So this is where I'm at, But then I started to become really educated. I started to read more theory. And eventually I created the channel Anarch, which, so I'm here, I guess. But, I created the channel. And when I did, I really felt like I had to devote myself to knowing what I was talking about. If I was going to make a contention, I wanted to be able to point my finger to where that contention rooted from and that other people had thought the same thing. So I started reading so much theory between then and now. I've just lost count of how much I've read. I've read things and forgotten them, But I think that, in answering the question a little more directly, why did I kind of tend towards anarchism? Well, because I started to look at all of the commonalities of what was going wrong. I looked at every single system that I thought was the problem, and I noticed there was a commonality between all of them, and that is that they were all hierarchical power structures, and that any place that anything inspirational seemed to be taking place, anything that actually gave me a reason to hope for the future, it was a bottom-up impulse. It was an impulse wherein the people shared power together, wherein they held horizontal power. They weren't powerless by any means. They were powerful with one another. And what I realized was this was not just my sort of abstract desire. that this actually was a real impulse that weaved its way throughout history, that it had every single time that a hierarchical power had concentrated, that there had been this uprising of a horizontal impulse, which offered hope, dignity, and a real potential for liberation to the people that were there. And I began to recognize that that's an eternal struggle so long as horizontal power is not able to overcome hierarchy. And that now at this point, I recognize that's because hierarchical power is the death impulse. It is the impulse of things that are dying. It is the constrainer of complexity. It is the constrainer of diversity. It tries to force everything into a rigid mechanistic mold. And that diversity is found in the impulses of cooperation and solidarity and freedom of human beings and their ability to achieve new things together. And yeah, at this point, I'm pretty much just an anarchist for life, I guess. I mean, after you have a series of realizations like that, I don't think there's any going back, you know.
It's interesting in terms of like the fact that it's also your American experience, the American electoral, the failings of American electoral, the American electoral system, and its bipartisanry. You know, the fact that it's that you only have two options might actually push you towards an alternative, because it's like, for example, in Canada and many European countries, there's more than just two parties, and it's easy to say, all right, well, this party failed or this party didn't go, I can go to another party. I can go to a more leftist party, and if that party doesn't do well, you know, I can continue to fight for that. Like I feel like there's a better there's better
more
reason.
Retention.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting to see, like, in the American way, like, because, and I don't know if you'll ever branch out of this bipartisanry for that retention.
The answer is no. I actually don't think it's systemically possible.
Yeah, because like that's the thing, because like eventually you'll have a lot of people who will ask for alternatives, and maybe perhaps the American system will have to develop a third party, at least just to give an outlet, you know, not an outlet, but a way for a lot of angry people to channel their anger through the electoral system. Because if it's not that, it's in the streets, or since it's America, it's with guns. So you probably don't want that. Because at least like in Canada and in Europe, very often, like, the Liberal Party is like more like it's in Canada, which with Justin Trudeau, it's more like the left, like center left, you know, like, oh, we accept trans people. And then for people who are not happy with, you know, I would call them like the Democrat kind of you know, equivalent, there's also the NDP, the New Democratic Party, which is more to the left. So if you're not happy with the Liberals, you don't have to be you don't have to be anarchist. You can, you know, if you're not happy with them, you can go with the NDP. So I don't know. I find it interesting that the bipartisanry of the system kind of forces you to the extremities, right? And I think it might be both on the right and on the left, though the right is actually appealing to the extremity. The Republican Party is appealing to the extremity that, you know, that fall out of these, and Democrats, I don't know if they ever will.
Yeah, no, I think you're right to some degree. I think that the fact, and that's because, you know, Canada's a parliament. That's a big difference. When you have a parliament, the mechanisms of power are very different. Mm-hmm. When you have a Congress like we do, you're never going to get a third party. If the third party exists for long enough that it threatens one of the other parties, it will just consume that party. And that's because of more than one reason. One is there are no coalition governments. That doesn't happen. Parties don't combine together to govern together. We elect our president directly. So the parliament doesn't, you know, get together and then determine the president. And there is no way that the president, you know, works through way of that coalition government. Number two is we have a first past the post system. That's a huge problem. First past the post system, it creates incentives for strategic voting, and strategic voting means that people are always going to be like, you know, you're either with me or against me kind of mentality. because they don't want to risk making the competitor to their enemy lose. So they're never going to support a third party in that sense. That could kind of probably be fixed with ranked choice, but even in places where there are third parties, they're very weak, and they pretty much always just siphon votes off of the Democrats. So the Democrats just see them as a threat and want to destroy them. Yeah, there's just a lot of reasons why here in the United States, we're never going to have a functional third party. As soon as we got a functional third party, it would eat one of the other parties, or vice versa. One of the other parties would eat it. But so we'd have to change our constitution to change that probably. And I doubt that's going to happen. We'll sooner fall into fascism than change our constitution.
Yeah, for sure. I'm actually, I don't know what you think about that. I'm reading Animal Farm right now. Well, I finished reading it to make a video on it, and how I think it's actually like, because I've seen people say it's not actually socialist or it's anti-communist, and I don't think it is.
No, it's definitely socialist, and it is not anti-communist.
Yeah, exactly. And there's the whole, they're writing on the walls the 7 commandments. And it made me think a lot, like the fact that it's so rigid and in stone, and the fact that you can interpret it in different ways. I was thinking, would you say that, for example, with the American, like the Constitution and all that, is there an authoritarian element to the fact, or at least a hierarchical element to the fact that it's so unshakable in its I don't want to say its authority, but in its, in its way of being? For example, the 7 commandments, they're not discussed. They're not flexible, right? They're there, and if like the powers can just, reinterpret them, and we see that with the Constitution as well. Is there an authoritarian element to the fact that it's not flexible, to the fact that they're not, that your amendments in the Constitution are not flexible? Or is it just,
we can amend the Constitution. It is flexible in that sense, but it just doesn't really get amended these days. And part of that is because the only ways that you can amend it are like you have to have like 2/3 of our entire representative system agreeing. That is to say 2/3 of the state have to agree to do it. So that's very uncommon. Or you have to have what's called a constitutional convention, which I don't think has ever happened. Maybe it's happened once. I don't remember, back in the really early days. But a constitutional convention is also very difficult to bring into existence. So it doesn't get amended very often, especially given that both parties are constantly just fighting over territory, and they would never be able to get together and agree. 2/3 of them couldn't agree to change the Constitution in any given way. It being inflexible certainly is one aspect of it, but I think that really the worst part of it is it wouldn't be better if they were able to just change it at a whim, because they would just now have this very flexible instrument for their authoritarianism. Yeah. I would say the problem is that we have no control over it, right? The masses don't have any way of really intervening on that besides electing representatives who we hope will do what we want. And of course they're not, because they don't care about us, and they have captured all of their constituencies. It's not like, if the Democrat doesn't do what I want, I'm not going to vote Republican probably. And they know that, and vice versa. So it basically means that when I elect somebody, they have no reason to listen to anything I want. Therefore, I basically have no power over anything as a voter. So the problem for me is not that there is this document that is a list of rules, and that those rules are to be followed until further notice. It's that list of rules is completely unaccountable to the masses, that we don't have any way to change that set of rules if we wanted to. Like, take, for example, here in the United States, where we have had consensus to legalize marijuana federally well before the first state ever did it. Okay, it's been like, I think it was like the late 2000s or something, where we had already two-thirds of the nation, more than 2/3 of the nation was already down, right? Doesn't matter what we think. 2/3 of our rulers have to agree to give us that right. Or for example, universal health care or some form of like Medicare expansion or something. There's an overwhelming majority, I think it's like 70% or something, if I recall correctly, who agree with it right now and have for a long time, well before Bernie ever came around. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. We don't get control over that. Our rulers get to make all our decisions for us. So yeah, that's the real problem in my mind. It's not that there's some list of rules. Those list of rules are completely unable to be edited or changed by the very people that set of rules is meant to bear on.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I was thinking was authoritarian is in the sense that it does like take away some, like even some powers for the people that you elect, but at the same time, like the people that you elect, we both agree on the fact that they're not necessarily like, no matter what, like they can interpret it any way they want. I think that's what you see in Orwell as well. And you don't even choose who gets to interpret them, or like the rules and all that. But yeah, no, it's something I keep thinking about. I'm trying to find all the authoritarian elements in Orwell's book, and all the socialist elements as well, where he's actually praising socialism. And that was one that came up to mind. And we're talking about the American system perhaps pushing you towards radicalization. Do you think your path to becoming anarchist would have been radically different had you been, let's say, a Canadian?
I mean, obviously, that's such a wild counterfactual. Yeah. I can't know the answer to a question like that. You know, obviously, it would have to be somewhat different. The conditions of Canada are very different than the conditions of the United States. Y'all are nowhere near as bad off as we are, right? Like, we've got so many systems are failing at the same time in the United States. It is horrific. You know, like we are descending into fascism so fast, it's astonishing. Canada is also, you know, declining. Like there are various systems which are failing and things which are going bad, but the decline is much slower and not as much. You had more good systems in place before there was noted decline began to take place. So there's more to dismantle. Whereas here in the United States, the most we ever got was the New Deal, and that was in like the 1940s, right? So like they've been trying to dismantle the New Deal for so long that by the time I'm born in the 1980s, you know, I'm born into a society that already kind of sucks, and they've taken away so much of even those programs by FDR and the progressives at the time. Whereas there in Canada, y'all have maintained a lot of those, you know, early gains that took place a long time ago. You haven't let as many of them degrade and fall apart. And I think that's partially because, you know, Canada wasn't at the helm of hegemonic power across the planet. You know, it wasn't the imperial aggressor of the planet, the exploiter and extractor of entire nations. And so wasn't driven to exploit its own people nearly as fast. However, its proximity to those things is indeed driving its decline, right? And I think as your social programs decline, as you allow more and more of your you know, wilderness to be destroyed for these projects, as you know, as these processes take place, people will become more miserable. I mean, it's terrible to say, but unfortunately, that's how change often happens. The system just has to demonstrate its inherent tendency towards failure. And so, yeah, it probably wouldn't have taken place in a similar way if I were there in Canada. But when I look at Canada from afar, I think that one of the biggest, I think one of the key aspects of exploitation is the exploitation of the Indigenous people there in Canada. I think that's one of the things that's extremely notable to me. And it's also notable to me that there doesn't seem to be a very strong public consciousness about that fact.
There really isn't. And it's very frustrating. It comes with a lot of prejudices and preconceived ideas about, because those communities face really harsh and it's like, even talking about it, sometimes people they get faced with their own bigotry, and it's hard to it's it makes for like really rough conversations, and it's so frustrating. For example, like a lot of times, and I feel like it's the same thing for like a lot of my marginalized communities. Their issues will be their problem. Like the reason why there's so many issues in Indigenous communities, it's their fault. They just gotta, stop doing crime and stop, this type of idea. And it's like trying to understand, trying to communicate like systemic, and like people hate the word systemic. It's been demonized, at least here. Like the issues, it makes like, why do you think these issues are in these communities? It's either social or biological. If you say it's biological, it's you're off the map. But most people won't say it's biological. So it's social. So what is the reason for this social issue? Most people say, well, sometimes it's in their culture. Or,
that's it. That's veiled. That's the veiled white supremacy, right?
Yeah.
That's what we had for decades. That's what we had for decades.
I know. It's so frustrating, and it's like, and I don't know how to deal with it, especially without wanting to isolate myself, which I already kind of have going through the rural area, right? But it's like sometimes you just don't want to engage with that, but like there's also a position of privilege of being able to not engage with that, right? So it's like, I don't know, those issues are really rough, at least for me, and I'm not even Indigenous. I worked 2 months in an Indigenous community as an ambulance driver. Fun fact, I don't think I've ever said that to the chat. I worked 2 months as an ambulance driver. I was 19 years old. I had my temporary driver's license, and I was an ambulance driver in a community that was only accessible by airplane. And the reason for that is my mom was a nurse there, so I had the opportunity to go. And I'm like, I don't even have my full driver's license. Are you gonna really make me drive in like a how do you call it, an ambulance? And they're like, yeah, we need whatever resources we can get, all hands on deck. If you've driven a car before, that works for us. And it was one hell of an experience. And the most frustrating thing is that, we were talking about proximity earlier, but very often the white people who were in proximity with the Indigenous people were the most racist people against Indigenous peoples that I've seen, despite being in the action, seeing the issues that Indigenous peoples are facing, especially is up north. So it's like very remote communities that were initially nomadic, and that were in French it's sédentarisé. Sedentarized?
Sedentary.
Yeah, they made them sedentary to show that there are communities up north, so that it was mostly a Russian thing. If we have nomadic peoples up north, that's not considered like a populated area. So we need to have cities that are populated in order to show that we're occupying the land in the north, so that the Russians don't come. Anyway, so they forcefully made them sedentary, and it came with a lot of challenges, obviously. And it's like the people who work with and very often respond to these challenges are the most racist people ever, because they're like, well, if they only adapted and only listened to us, they wouldn't be facing these issues. And I find that super interesting, that despite this proximity, you are still very, very bigoted. It's I don't know how to tackle that, honestly. I really don't know. And like people will use that as an authority as well. I've worked 5 years with Indigenous peoples. You have no idea.
I have a black friend. I can't be racist.
Yeah. Well, no, it's like, well, no, actually, it's even more pernicious than that. It's, I live in a black community, or I've worked in a black community, so I know how bad, how bad they can be. It's like justifying their bigotry because they've experienced the situation. How do you deal with that? I don't know.
Well, I think there's kind of maybe like three distinct aspects of what I would suggest here. Number one, I think this one probably ranks highest, is find some way to help Indigenous people. I think that more than trying to figure out how to get, people who benefit from the subjugation of Indigenous people to accept them, probably finding out some way to materially benefit those Indigenous peoples should be priority number one. Demonstrating solidarity, doing what you can in order to help them. I think that's probably that's the first thing on the list. And I think I've already forgotten the third one, but the second one is absolutely, yeah. I mean, you need to spread information such that these people can recognize the facts of the matter. It's obviously going to be important. And it's interesting to me that, here in the United States, Indigenous people's struggles is pretty notable, and it's their radical actions, like, are definitely broadcasted. Whereas up there, it seems like they don't really get nearly as much notice. And when they are noticed, they're almost usually demonized. Like down here, we don't demonize them. Down here, we're like, yeah, that's fucking sweet. And then, but up there, it kind of seems like everybody sees them as like terrorists for trying to do anything to defend themselves.
Yeah. And it's really like bad. Like at one point there was the blocking of the railway road for Wet'suwet'en, in support of Wet'suwet'en, and like that was perhaps one of the only things that only like protests that I've seen covered on Wet'suwet'en in Quebec, because they don't really care that much if it's outside of Quebec anyway. But like in support of Wet'suwet'en, I don't even think they mentioned in the coverage of that action Wet'suwet'en. All they did is saying, oh, it's for Indigenous rights or whatever. But what was really bad is the fact that they're blocking the railroad, and it's like when Indigenous issues are mentioned up or brought up in the media, it's very often periodically, like the same way you would see like homelessness, right? Like here, homelessness is like every same time of the year. It's during the winter. Oh, how sad is it that homeless people are outside during Christmas, So it's like, it's become that I don't know how to say it, like that placeholder, or that the same like mold. All right, it's time. Let's take out the Indigenous sob story, how bad it is. But there's no concrete action, and I don't know if it's the same in the US, but at least when it comes to like in Montreal, for example, there are two is it in English, is it reservations, yes, reservation. There's one in the north, one in the south, and like but there's, at least from my understanding, there's not that much mixity, or and aside from that, then people don't know any other, where other Indigenous people are. That's basically the only Indigenous people in Quebec. There's a whole ton of them in the north, but we don't necessarily, especially people who live in Montreal, don't necessarily know. Half of Quebec's population is concentrated. I imagine Tulsa as well. It's like half of the population of the whole province or state is concentrated in the urban area. So there's this how do you say it? This like distance between yourself and the people who are living these struggles that kind of make them as well even like less, like invisibilizes them in a way, right? Especially when you talk about, yeah. Sorry. Well, especially when you talk about like communities that live up north, sometimes without water or electricity, in conditions where they have snow all the way till like July, right? And it's like, those are, to a lot of people, and like this it's another country out there, right? It's not even Like you could be talking about the plight of thirsty, you know, Africans or whatever, you know, to them it's the same thing. And even when I was up there, I remember, because it's such a different, you know, situation. My mom giving me like a $20 bill, and she's like, "Oh, can you go buy some Coke or like some Pepsi at the grocery store?" And me thinking, wait, do they accept Canadian money? Which is like such a weird reflex, but it's such a different condition. And like for a lot of people, it's just another third world, right? It's just another third world country. So there's this invisibilization, but there's also this distance. I don't know if there's that distance as well in the US.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think one of the big differences, however, is that the Indigenous people here in the United States, okay, so one of the key things is that they are continually acting, right? There's continually something that is taking place in one of these, because we kind of have a lot of reservations still. I mean, you know, by comparison to how many once existed, not a lot, but by comparison to what you're describing, a lot. Okay, like there's Indigenous peoples that are still all over the place here in the U.S., and they are fighting and on their land in all of those places. I think part of it is that, you know, organizers and activists here they're very vocal about spreading that information. That's one part of it. But it's also that there's not a news cycle. Like it's coming back into the news all the time because there's constantly stuff happening. So insofar as that, what I would say, it's probably try to do your best to amplify their major actions and to provide a sympathetic voice in those occasions. Basically just ask yourself what kind of aid could be provided, and ask if there are sufficiently like radical organizations that you could, if not necessarily join, because I don't think you are Indigenous yourself, maybe just provide assistance to, you know, reach out to and see if there is some way to provide assistance. Because I think that's a key aspect, is anarchists should always be trying to provide solidarity to the oppressed, and always trying to provide, you know, resources, expertise, and to help them in their struggle. So probably helping them break that cyclic news, you know, that news cycle, to break out of that news cycle. That'd probably be a very important aspect of it, as insofar as that is doable. Obviously by yourself, you can't do that, but that's the kind of angle that I would say needs to take place. One of the things about Occupy that made it so successful in changing the conversation is that Occupy was very conscious about how it provoked media attention, and that it continually provoked media attention, and that it continually kept staging direct actions that were disruptive, and therefore the media couldn't not, you know, oh my God, this is such a circus. And then when we would gain access to the media, we would just spread radical messaging. Like that's it. They wouldn't get any milquetoast stuff. We would just give them only our, you know, embryonic class messaging. So I think that's a part of it. I think there probably needs to be a movement that is situated within the Canadian experience. It's not just a mirror of the waves in the US, because your conditions are different. You know, like your conditions.
That's asking a lot, though.
They were. I mean, obviously, you know. I mean, things haven't got as bad. So you. No, it hasn't.
Not being American. That's asking for a lot.
Oh yeah, you not mimicking America. Well, I hear that a lot. Yeah. From people all over the planet, but but it's something that needs to be done, because Canada has its own context, and the tactics we're using here in the United States are the tactics we're using after the struggle has moved this far, right? That we have advanced the struggle to this degree where these are the tactics and approaches we're using. These are the topics that we're breaching. But your situation kind of reminds me of like the US in like the 90s or like the early 2000s or something. And these tactics would not have been the right tactics at that point, I don't think. I don't know, maybe they would have. Maybe that's a mistake we made. But I think that using these tactics where you're just trying to change the conversation, right? You know, I know there's like Jagmeet Singh, for example, is kind of a notable figure there in changing the conversation. So I know that electoral politics is kind of a vector for that there. But I think that it's really important that electoral politics not be the vector for, or not the only vector at least, for that radical conversation. I think that conversation has to come from people who are organizing on the ground, who are doing things that actually challenge power. So I don't know if it seemed like a ramble.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting, like for the in terms of because now that you've brought that up, now I want to hop on that, like for electoral politics. Do you think that it's, for example, how much do you give Bernie the credence on radicalizing a large part of the U.S. population in terms of
Bernie was a
leftist?
useful megaphone, you know, like he was very useful for introducing that word, for destigmatizing the word socialism in the United States. Yeah. That was valuable. What I will say is that there were also downsides, because the version of socialism, quote unquote, that he popularized was not worker ownership of the means of production. It was social democracy. It was lots of social programs and regulation and things like that. Maybe some nationalization of industry. That old sort of social democracy or state capitalism, if it goes far enough. So there were ups and downs, because a lot of the socialists it created were social democrats, but it did start a radical conversation. So that is valuable. Is valuable that conversation gets started, but it's also really important that radicals, once that conversation gets started in just that exact fashion, that they absolutely do not just piggyback on that figure, but instead use this as a platform, a sort of springboard to begin a much more radical conversation, a revolutionary conversation, and to use every one of these conversations to push forward something way more radical than that figure. Because that figure will 100% stop well before the revolutionary rhetoric begins, right?
Yeah, of course.
And so, Bernie was helpful in what he did, but he also diverted a lot of real useful energies. He also confused a lot of people about what socialism actually means. So, it adds ups and downs.
Yeah. It's interesting. Okay, I'm going to go on a rant, and I want to know what you think, because I feel like sometimes there might be a double standard. Okay, I'll preface this by saying, when I read, do you know Nerdwriter, the video essayist?
Yeah.
I reviewed his book. He sent me a book so I can read it before, and I reviewed it for the day that it came out. And in that video, I called him I was kind of dark on it. I don't know why, but I called him politically castrated, in the sense that. And he was really nice about it, and maybe I should have toned it down. But I have this, sometimes I get really frustrated about the fact that a lot of people who denounce capitalism won't denounce capitalism. They will denounce consumerism, right? And it's very often more. Sometimes it won't even be liberals. It can be I imagine a lot of content creators that are very much so on the left won't use the terms capitalism, communism, socialism, whatever, because they're trying to dog whistle their way, and it annoys me so much. And that's one of the reasons why I said that about Nerdwriter, which I sometimes I regret doing. And I remember saying, at one point you said in the video about aesthetic radicalization, or I don't remember exactly the aesthetics of being radical, saying you're an anarchist in your Twitter bio is doesn't do much. Or perhaps doesn't do nothing. But I'm thinking in terms of if we switch the script, and we make it more like a right-leaning, if a content creator is a fascist but doesn't say he's a fascist, that content creator is actually doing is benefiting fascism in that way. It may you'll probably say that it's not equivalent, and I'm seeing you coming there, and it would be I want you to comment on that, but I'd rather have I'd rather a fascist say that he's a fascist than appeal to people who are more moderate by not saying he's a fascist. And if someone on Twitter says if it's normalized that in their Twitter bio they say fascist, if that becomes normalized, that can actually be harmful and can actually, help fascism. And if, for example, a right-wing politician did a Bernie thing and said, I'm a fascist, but fascist doesn't mean Nazism. It just means the core values of, of tradition and, of patriotism. Like, I don't think many fascists would say, hey, you've devalued what fascism is by giving people a milquetoast version of it, right? The same way we're criticizing Bernie for devaluing socialism. Again, both are very different movements and appeal differently to different people in very radical ways, very extreme ways. But I want to know, what do you think about that? Because I feel like there's a double standard sometimes in that way. I want leftists to say that they're leftists high and strong, but at the same time, I don't want fascists to do it because it benefits me. So probably for fascists, it benefits content creators to say, they'd probably prefer people to say that they're loudly communists. Because I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, no, totally. Everything you're saying makes sense.
Okay,
so
perfect.
I think, there's a few complicating factors. Number one, the fascists already have power. They can dog whistle themselves all the way into the concentration camps, or, all the way until they're making concentration camps, right? Because they have the power. We are an insurgent movement, right? So what we have to do is provide a radical alternative way of looking at the world and a alternative approach to changing the world, right? Whereas the fascist, well, he can just be the fascist and have power and control of the state and everything's good. Boom, that's praxis for him, right? He can call himself a fascist, not call himself a fascist. Probably more useful for him not to call himself a fascist, because then he gets to do fascism without calling himself a fascist. And that's why they spend so much time pretending they're not, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really matter too much whether they produce a milquetoast version of fascism, because they're already doing it. They can just go right into the state and do a fascism. Whereas we can't go straight into the state and do an anarchism, nor do we have a dominant, or a whatever hegemonic power, nor do we have the dominant. We don't have the wheels in our the wheels not in our hands, right? We pretty much have to acquaint people with a new way of thinking, which is going to be very challenging to do if they have no word to accord it to, or the word that it accords to has been heavily distorted and they're very confused about what it means. For example, the word anarchism or socialism or communism. So there is a struggle at hand where people need to know the meaning of these words so that they can know what it is that people are struggling for. And if when I tell somebody I'm a socialist, they think I mean I want a lot of welfare programs, that's actually kind of an impediment to me, because what that means is that is what they think I think socialism is. And now I have to go through all of this effort re-educating them about what socialism actually is. No, that's social democracy, or in its furthest form, we might call it state capitalism. And no, socialism is worker ownership of the means of production. It adds new layers where we have to clarify what's meant. Now, of course, you could take an alternative approach where the crypto approach, as you said, where you just present the ideas themselves and you don't give them a title. You don't call socialist or communist or anarchist or whatever. I think that's totally fine. If that works, it works. As for my own part, I think it's important to make the meaning of these words known and to identify ourselves as these words in such a way that I think there are a few different reasons. Number one, it demonstrates integrity. We're not trying to trick anybody, right? I mean, I understand that there's some amount of, just not using a word that scares people. I'll use another word that means the same thing, just doesn't scare people. I get it. There's nothing wrong with that. But also just being yeah, I'm an anarchist. And so number two, it gives them an example of what an anarchist is. I come on right here and we're having a talk, right? I probably don't look like what most people would assume an anarchist looks like. And I'm probably not communicating in a way most people would think anarchists communicate, because they don't know what an anarchist is. All they've had is propaganda stuffed down their throat. My very presence and my open avowal of being an anarchist kind of provides a new image for anarchism to people, and that's valuable to some degree. So I'm being honest about my intentions. I'm giving them an image of what an anarchist is. And then lastly, there's kind of a third component that I think is super important. And that is you want to connect people to a history of struggle and a body of theory. So when I say I'm an anarchist, there is now a whole body of theory and a bunch of struggles throughout history of anarchists that are connected to this. And when I use the right words for things, I'm also doing a sort of light theoretical education in the process. And if I use this word federation or confederation, if I use the word solidarity, or I define what freedom means, they're going to go to the theory and they're going to actually know what the heck they're reading. Whereas if I spend all my time being crypto and pretending I was something else and using all kinds of alternative words, they're going to go, the theory is going to be meaningless to them. So I've cut them off from their history. I've cut them off from a bunch of work that they could educate themselves with. And by not calling myself anarchist, it's as if I'm trying to disconnect myself from the actions of the anarchists of the past, which I'm not. The anarchists of the past many of them have been utterly heroic. And I want to connect myself to that history of struggle, and for people to feel connected to that history of struggle. I think that's really important. So this is what I mean when I say that's kind of like a double-edged sword, because all those concerns are actually really important. So when Bernie comes forward, he popularizes this word socialism. And on the one hand, you have a lot of people are going to go just learn what socialism actually means, right? They're going to go and they're going to do the research for themselves. They're going to research, socialism is actually about worker ownership and socialization of the means of production. Oh, okay, cool. But a lot of other people are going to hear from Bernie Sanders, socialism is exactly what the propagandists told you it was, but it's good, but that's actually good, And then what you have is a whole bunch of people that are struggling for something like almost completely different. So it's like we face very different struggles being an insurgent movement that has to educate people about what the heck we even mean when we say anything. And that kind of sucks. That's just kind of the part of history we're in, because when the last wave of revolutions happened, now I'm getting a little off the rails, so I'll keep this part short. But when the last wave of revolutions happened between the 1850s and the early 1900s, that was after decades of public education and discussion about the meaning of all of these words, such that what it meant to be an anarchist, or what it meant to be a socialist, or what it meant to be a communist was just kind of common knowledge of the people who were in society. There'd just been a series of discussions that were very public and had taken place in a variety of venues that let people know what the heck it meant when you said that. Like, what did it, and there were key figures who would popularize what each of those words meant, such that people knew what they meant. And then they could connect to those movements meaningfully then. And we're unfortunately kind of in that period right now, where we're not in that wave of revolutionary struggle. I'm not trying to discard Rojava or Zapatistas or whatever, but we're in this era where we actually got to lay in the foundations. So we actually need to be very explicit about what everything means and what we mean when we say everything. So sorry to ramble too long, but that's kind of my answer to the question.
Yeah, I was expecting a longer answer, because it like, to me, it's an interesting question, an interesting topic to discuss. And I feel like there's also a difference. There's also like a very sharp difference between leftism and fascism, in terms of just theory. We reread with Stream. I started doing like Wikipedia read-throughs just for fun, and we did one on fascism just to give it the basis and tell people, encourage people, if you don't know something, you can go on Wikipedia. It's not a book, but it can help. And the whole idea of post, it's a theoretical, fascism very often is doesn't necessarily have theory, and is very often it's very hard to identify, just because it's so it doesn't have a tradition of fascism, in the sense that it's so how do I say this? It's so malleable. It goes fascism in Italy will be very different from fascism in France and in Germany, and I believe that because of that, there wouldn't be much it wouldn't affect as much if you say like, hey, I'm a fascist, or like trying to rehabilitate or normalize the word fascism. Because very often it doesn't mean that much, in the sense that like, it's, what is it, right? It'll be something different in the United States than something in Germany, something in Italy. While leftism has a really strong, common, like it could be Italian anarchism. There are differences between, different places because it's a different context. But the struggles and the ideas and the principles will be the same. And I feel that because of that, you do want to direct people towards this body and this tradition, and there's like a tradition that you want to show like there's a continuation of that tradition as well, right? And I think that for fascism, there's not really that. There are for tradition, but like in a very different way, right? And I find it also interesting that you talk about how, talking about continuing this tradition and how like it was very normalized at one point. And it's like the third time I bring up this anecdote, but like Frida Kahlo's husband, Diego Rivera, was a communist, and he made a mural at the Rockefeller Center for, I think it's probably some Rockefeller person, and he painted a portrait of Karl Marx and Lenin in like the lobby of the Rockefeller Center, which obviously they didn't like. And people asked like, why did you hire a communist to make a mural? And the Rockefeller was like, Rivera said, well, how could you find like an artist nowadays that is not a communist? Like, good luck finding an artist that's not a communist. Same thing for philosophers, right? A lot of philosophers back then can think of like post-war, like even like pre-war, like Sartre and like all the existentialists in France and all that, all like university professors were all leftists, like self-proclaimed, I am a Marxist. I don't not hiding it. And that did, like, people don't have that affinity with those words anymore because they're not as present as they used to be. So it's also normalizing these words to make them, but I don't think as a fascist, if they were normalizing these words, it doesn't help them as it does for us, right? I think it can really help us to say, I'm an anarchist, and it breaks down what you think an anarchist is. So many people are like, wait, like, I think it helps the fact that people have preconceived ideas of what anarchism is or what communism is. I love hitting people with the idea that, oh, libertarian? Oh, so that means you're a socialist, right? Well, what do you mean? But it's like, oh, go on Wikipedia. Like Wikipedia, like, go look for libertarian. Where does it come from? Oh, it has its roots in socialism. And like, just that in itself can be a very powerful rhetorical tool. As in fascism, they don't really have that. Like, oh yeah, I'll say I'm fascist. Oh yeah, let's look up fascism online. Let's see what comes up. Yeah, great. Yeah, perhaps I will refrain. And even if you normalized it, you can make it mean pretty much anything anyway. Oh, it doesn't need to be genocidal. We can just have two different, like the whites here, the blacks there, and like we don't need to kill anyone. We can just, So I know I do agree with you that like there's a difference, and I really like the continuation of that tradition, of that anarchist tradition. And that's one of the reasons why I love anarchist history so much, and it always feels that anarchists have always been right, and it's like it's something that you have to take with a grain of salt, because like, if history shows that you're always right, perhaps there's something wrong. But it's really hard. I don't know. What would you answer to that, right? Like, because anarchists always seem to be like almost like, how do I say this? Like puritanical in everything. Oh, then like Emma Goldman saying, "Oh yeah, it's fine that we killed the president." Yeah, no, I support that. So maybe like we're not that puritanical, but you know what I mean? Like, what would you say about like the history of anarchism being so?
Well, what I will say is that, okay, so insofar as that anarchists have always got it right, it's just that they understand how power functions. the anarchist knows how power really functions. So what that means is their predictions of what power is going to do are like perfect. Like, it's mind blowing. They're just constantly making these predictions of exactly how power structure is going to function. And then like a few decades later, they do exactly what the anarchists say they're going to do. And that's because the anarchist is absolutely right about how to approach power structures. And the result is that they have a method that doesn't fall victim to the very things they see happening within these hierarchical power structures. But I think what it really comes down to is that the solution is just not easy. The solution's just hard. Like, the things that have to be done are just not straightforward. And even though they're kind of common sense, every aspect of hierarchical society is trying to convince us not to do those things, which is to say, to resist, to build bonds of cooperation and solidarity with all different kinds of people, to create counter structures that are horizontal structures and not hierarchical structures, to not try to embed ourselves in the enemy structure. Rather, if you were a spy or something, it'd be fine. But, to not try to gain power through the enemy structure, which is to say, do direct action, right? To understand that whatever your means are, condition your ends, and whatever your ends are, condition what means you should do, or means ends unity. So these things are just kind of harder. They just take more work. They take concerted effort. We have to build a mass movement. So insofar as like Emma Goldman trying to kill the president, propaganda of the deed is it's got a mixed record, like every once in a while, maybe you could say it worked out well, but a lot of the time it worked out really bad. And that's part of the reason why the anarchists have sort of abandoned these, assassination campaigns. Is it was a real mixed record. Every once in a while it worked out well, and most of the time it just ended up getting everybody crushed in the process. Anarchism isn't right about everything, but their prediction for how power structures will function is spot on. That they pretty much are never wrong about how hierarchical power is going to function, but it is very experimental in its methodology for changing society. So what that means is you're going to get lots of experiments that didn't work out so hot, right? Like, you're going to find lots of methods that don't work. And anarchism is actually pretty good at exploring a variety of different methods. It's very iterative. It's very experimental.
That's one thing I love to say to people as a rhetorical tool. The whole idea, like, let's say you're a utopian for thinking that anarchism would work, but like, I think like a utopian would need to like give you like a recipe for something to work, like for a way of doing a society, like doing a organizing society. And I feel like the kind of people who do that is like, for example, capitalists and state communists do that as well. Give a recipe for, and I feel like that might be utopian. But when you just say, all right, like, it's more of a, I really love like the formula that it's a method, in the sense that like it gives you the ability to do it yourself. It's not like, all right, you got to do this, that, and then at the end, all right, you have your anarchy, you're good. Because that I feel like is problematic. And when I have people, all right, well, you have to show me that, like, propose a system, and if we all agree on it, we can just adopt it. It's like a system is not. That's
how it works.
Yeah, it's not how it works. Capitalism has developed, and I think anarchism can also develop and answer challenges in ways that are with in accordance to our values and our methods. I think that's a really good rhetorical tool to say, hey, listen, we're not utopians. And I do think the fact that like very often history of anarchism paints the anarchist as almost perfect is kind of funny, but like, and it's true, their records of predicting power structures is spot on. But it is true, like, because when I said that, I was like, yeah, like anarchists are so amazing. But then I thought of like, the like President McKinley being assassinated and everybody hating like anarchists after that. Maybe that's like maybe a miss. Maybe it's not always like super green. But I was thinking, so ways of you talked about experimentation and all that. I've heard someone say, I read a comment earlier during the stream that said there's a comment earlier in the stream that said that we were the evil twins of anarchism. But I don't know what that means.
Who that we are the me and you are the evil twins of anarchy?
Yeah, in a way. I
don't know. Do we have that kind of resemblance? I don't know. It doesn't seem like it.
I need like I have longer hair. We have the beard.
Yeah.
I don't have the glasses.
Go. That's enough. Yeah, that's correct. Yes, they got it.
But another comment was, do you have any examples of anarchy in action? I'm using anarchy in action as but like of anarchy working, of anarchy because they're like, oh, it's like all great in theory, or like I'm getting a bit of a sense of what it is in theory, but in what does it look like in real practice? And I was like, I'll ask Daniel. I gave an answer myself. Well, I gave like a really short answer, and I was like, this is what I think Daniel will answer. How you will answer? So like, please answer that question. I'll see if my prediction was good.
Well, I mean, insofar as the word anarchy, I consider anarchy to be something that we haven't really achieved. But insofar as we're talking about anarchism, something like something that, a structure that utilizes anarchism or an anarchist society, an anarchist structure of some kind, we have lots of those. There's been lots of examples. I mean, one of the most famous ones, one that was very inspiring in the early 1900s, or in the 1900s, was the C&T FAI in Spain. I think that's one that a lot of people look to. The C&T FAI in Spain created federations of councils and worker cooperatives and communes, wherein in the urban centers, they mostly did worker cooperatives and had councils that essentially everybody was part of the councils, and the councils would come together and basically directly democratically make decisions together about how everything would work, including the economy and the cooperatives themselves. And out in the countrysides, they were fully decommodified. That is to say, there was no exchange of money. They just simply distributed their products to the rest of the territory, and they were distributed what they needed from the rest of the territory. And you might be saying to yourself, oh, okay, well, that what was that, like a few hundred people? It's like, no, that was hundreds of thousands of people. I think the number I got was close to like 1 million or more, if I recall correctly. So it was an enormous swath of Spain that was controlled, and it lasted about 3 years. And the only reason it ended is because they were in the middle of a civil war, and their enemies were the Republic, which was being backed by Stalin, and Franco, who was being backed by Hitler. So they had two world powers bankrolling their enemies, and they still lasted 3 years. So if you want to learn more about that, I suggest reading more about C&T FAI. There's also the Free Territories in Ukraine, which was a little looser, but it followed very similar principles. You had, a decommodification of parts of the economy. You had lots of cooperatives and council federations. They were also in the middle of a civil war. They won their civil war against the White Army there in Ukraine, and then the Red Army in Russia, once again, Stalin crushed the Free Territories of Ukraine, actually betrayed them in both occasions. Both of these, that Stalin, the USSR, betrayed the anarchists and led to the end of massive nation-spanning projects and plunged enormous numbers of people into capitalism. In Spain, literally led to the victory of fascism, helped Franco win. And in the Free Territories, essentially allowed Russia to just control Ukraine. You also have a lot in contemporary examples. You could probably look at something like the Zapatistas, even though they're not explicitly anarchist, or Rojava, which is also not explicitly anarchist, but both of them are following pretty similar to models that the anarchists would advocate. I would say more so the Zapatistas than Rojava. These are both currently existing societies. The Zapatistas is about 300,000 people in the Chiapas district in Mexico. And Rojava, I think if I recall correctly, was like 3 to 4 million people. And both of these function, again, through federations of councils that are directly democratic down at the level of the people. The people make decisions about how the things will act in the world around them. They develop rules and agreements that they all agree to follow. If decisions need to be made over some bigger region, it is handed off to a federation of those councils, and the federation of councils makes decisions. To answer this question, you'd have to have like an even more specific, what do you mean? How did it work? And, you mean which aspect of how it worked? Are you interested in how they made decisions, or how did they fight a war? Or, you have to get into a lot of specifics. These were broad, big societies, right? Like they covered everything you would need to cover. They had economics, they had defense. They had to deal with criminality or antisocial behavior. Like all of them have addressed these problems. And those are just 4 examples, but there are way more examples. One time I created a list, and there's like, I think like over 50 different examples of places that have either utilized anarchist principles, movements that were anarchist, or entire autonomous regions that were utilizing libertarian, socialist, or anarchist principles. So we actually have a lot of examples. And that is even bearing in mind that it's just in the modern era. If you're interested in ancient examples, this sort of anarchist method of establishing horizontal power structures was rife throughout the ancient world. Like you go back to, preceding, modern society or recorded history, and anthropology suggests there was a proliferation of horizontal societies. Some of them resting in large polities, large cities. I highly recommend, if people are interested in that, they read The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber. You'll find that there were tons of indigenous societies. You'll also find that there were, in this sort of interim period between those old societies and the rise of a complete monarchy, that there were free territories or free cities out in Europe, even in Italy, Spain, and Germany. There were like entire like cities that function in a very horizontal manner, where decisions were made through free agreement. And these were flourishing cities. These were places like Venice, for example, where they were the cradle of civilization at the time, and they resisted monarchy far longer than the centralized or hierarchical city states that were around them. So yeah, we have a ton of examples. Like it's been done a lot. And the reason probably why most of you have never heard of it is because why would they want to tell you that history? Why would your oppressor, why would the people who want to convince you there's no alternative ever tell you anything I just said? Like, why would they want you to know that those examples have existed in all stages of history, and that they worked, and that they were often some of the most effective forms of resistance to hierarchical power? Obviously, they're not going to tell you that. So there you go.
Yeah, so my prediction was wrong. You mentioned David Graeber. I thought you would tackle it, and I think you could have tackled it, but you tackled it very well still. But I was thinking maybe in the sense of you might already, like the text, you might already be an anarchist. Here's why. Goes something along those lines.
Yeah, like I don't take that angle personally.
No, do you not like it, or you think it's not as effective?
I think that it's true to some degree that this is just kind of a fiddly theoretical disagreement I have with Graeber, but that's basically just that you can be solidaric, you can act with a cooperative impulse, and yet not be putting into place an anarchist structure or an anarchist society, right? You could be in a hierarchical structure, and you treat people well, and you're nice to people, and you'd make agreements together, but you still live in a hierarchical structure that has control over your life. So I tend to think of anarchism as a method. So yes, it's true that maybe that cooperative impulse kind of embodies an anarchist method, an anarchist approach to solving problems. But I don't want to give people that example, because then they might imagine that when we say we're trying to create an anarchist society, they just mean a society where we're all really nice to each other and we like form agreements before we do things, it's a lot more than that, and it's spanned way bigger. We have structures the size of entire nations to look at as to how do those principles scale up. So I think that Graeber's essay, Are You an Anarchist? The Answer Might Surprise You, is kind of helpful to help people understand that decisions can be made through free agreement and consensus, and that we don't have to dominate one another to make decisions. But I think that often when people are looking for the answer to how would anarchism deal with problems, they're asking about how would it deal with problems where there are hundreds of thousands or millions of people that are all being subsumed under the structure. What does the anarchist suppose that we're going to do to solve those problems? So I tend to answer in the largest scale that I can.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. There's also there's this comment that someone left. I don't know if they're still there. Japser, and people are calling him troll, but I think, or them, and I think I think they're in good faith, and I was thinking maybe you could answer that question. It's like a basic refutation against anarchism, but I think it's a popular one, and I think he says, I'm extremely new to the ideas of anarchy, and I will openly say I don't agree with it. My question is, does society not need a form of power imbalance to stop individuals from harming society? So basically antisocial behavior, how, army, police, how do anarchists, and I feel like that's one of the big, I don't know how to say it, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, this question I consider honestly one of the more complicated ones to answer, because there's so many details we need to figure out exactly what kind of thought experiments being played out here. But okay, if we're just talking about people being able to defend themselves, anarchism doesn't suggest that we're just going to be all defenseless and have no bodies for coordination to help people defend themselves. Anarchism is sort of famously advocates the creation of militias and federations of militias, which themselves defend autonomous territories and, oust people from power. So clearly anarchism doesn't advocate that we're just powerless. Okay. Anarchism advocates self-defense. So insofar as that, someone is trying to harm you as an individual or groups of people, those people are justified in defending themselves. Moreover, bodies of resistance and defense which have been created elsewhere may be very well informed in helping them defend themselves. Let's say I'm one person and somebody's threatening to hurt me. Okay, well, there's probably going to be a militia which is situated within this area, and that militia consists of the people who are in that area. And that militia could be asked to defend you from that person. Or let's say there's some insurgent military some opposing military that's trying to seize into your territory. Well, you're going to federate the militias together in order to defend yourself. Okay. I want to emphasize, and I think this is one of the major mistakes that people make. I think this is probably the most common mistake that people make when they're trying to understand anarchism or refute it or whatever. Anarchism is not against individuals having different amounts of power. Okay. I know that sounds kind of shocking, but it's true. It's okay that one person, for example, is a genius doctor and somebody else is not. Somebody else is a genius woodworker. That's okay. Those powers are different powers. People are allowed to be good and bad at different things, and all the woodworkers don't have to be just as good at something as one another, right? You can have woodworkers that are better and worse at being a woodworker and so on. That's not anti-anarchist to have differences in power. The anarchist is not opposed to individual differences in power. What they are opposed to is the establishment of hierarchical power structures, structures which standardize the use of power, and wherein some people are privileged as a class above others, or privileged as a sort of strata of control above everyone else. And in those hierarchical power structures, that's where power or decision making is concentrated into a smaller and smaller and smaller group of people, such that there is monopolization of power. So what are we getting at? Like, what's an example? Well, we're not against like militias. We're against the army, where the power is fully centralized at the very top. It's completely pyramidal, and all power flows from the top down. That's an example of monopolization of power. Or take the police, for example. They have fully monopolized the domestic violence, right? They're the only people allowed to go around doing domestic violence. And I don't mean like domestic abuse, like, in a household or something. But just insofar as we're talking about the force to defend or carry out some form of violence, that is fully monopolized in the police and the National Guard and so on. Whereas the anarchists would say it should be decentralized, not like everybody should go around hurting one another, but that the bodies which are able to defend people and to enforce that self-defense are bodies which are able to make decisions through the councils and federations of councils. So notice the power no longer flows from some top node downwards, and all decisions are made there at the very top. Power is now sort of devolved down into all of these horizontal structures, and the structures join together at the scales needed to address the problems as they stand. Now, this is what I said, and this is like a really complicated question, because it's like, what exactly does one mean when they say what they said in that comment? But like, okay, now you're just talking about like antisocial behaviors, like somebody who just, literally all the words I would want to say are words that get people demonetized on YouTube. Okay, murder,
it's not monetized,
the
don't worry.
R-word, the rest of the stuff. Okay, y'all know what I'm talking about here. Okay. These acts of interpersonal violence. Well, as most anarchists have said, one of the first things you have to address is that most of those acts, they root from the way this structure or this society is structured. Okay? So like most of those acts are acts of desperation or mental illness or destabilization, distress, hopelessness. The vast majority of people who are harming one another are not harming one another because they just really like hurting people. Okay, that's a really uncommon thing. Sadism is really uncommon in humans. So like the vast majority of these sorts of antisocial crimes, as we might call them now, most of them would probably not exist in an anarchist society. You would have solved most of the things that lead people to these crimes of desperation. Well, this still leaves the question, what do you do with the people who really are just sadists, who really do just like hurting people? They like hurting other people. They just derive pleasure from it. Even if they don't benefit from it, they just like doing it. Well, once again, people have the right to defend themselves, and they have the right to exile others. They don't have to associate with those people. They have the right to get those people out of their society. So the answer as to how you actually deal with them, it's kind of an open question. There's lots of answers which have been offered. Obviously there's going to be some split between three different methods. You either are going to kill them, which personally I'm not a big fan of. That'd be like the death penalty. You're going to detain them, which, maybe there's some kind of mixed use there. Obviously you don't want to recreate prisons, or you exile them. And that's got a spotty track record. It worked better in ancient societies. But like, those are your three options for people who are like that. And I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think the answer is. Because I'll tell you, the anarchist community is pretty split on which of those three answers you use for the worst of the worst, the people who truly are manipulators and sadists.
Even the death penalty?
believe it or not, that one is actually among like egoists and individualist anarchists. That's often their go-to answer. They're like, yeah, that's just, self-defense. You just shoot them. And it's like, I don't know if that's how I want to structure society.
Yeah.
But then if you suggest detainment, they'll say you want to create anarcho prisons. So anyway, we won't get too bogged down in this, but that's an open question. That one there, I'll say, is at least somewhat of an open question. So if you're expressing some amount of skepticism or you're questioning that kind of thing, I'll at least tell you that, different anarchists have different opinions on that particular one. Personally, I would prefer detainment over murdering people or kicking them into the middle of a forest, but that's just me.
Yeah. I don't know how often, like, if it also it's like a lost cause, like you suffer
Probably
from sadism.
Not very often, right?
Yeah, I can't believe there's no ways to like to cope with sadism. Like, I don't know.
I mean, obviously, what I didn't mention is that you would want to create robust therapy services.
Yeah,
the default would always be that you're trying to figure out what's wrong with a person that makes them want to do these things, right?
Exactly.
Like before you would do any of those three extreme solutions I just noted, I think that you'd be obligated to put them through intensive therapy of some kind and make sure they're not continuing to hurt other people. And if they're not continuing to hurt other people, I don't know. You just move on, I guess. Reparations for the person who was harmed. Try to repair the damage as best as possible. Make sure that further harms are not caused, and that's really all you can do.
Yeah. It's Jasper just answered, and he said, "I understand. Those ideas make a lot of sense as a way to better society." I really like the idea of saying you're taking away a lot of the causes of crime. If you're able to identify what the causes of crime are, and I've always felt like that could be a bit copy, like you're coping a bit by saying, oh well, we'll have to deal with a lot less crime because like we're taking away the roots of crime. But at the same time, it's kind of true. I feel like if people have access to food or like they have access to material goods to like however much they need, there's no reason to have any property. How can you have property theft if there's no property?
Right.
And things like that, like less alienation, less isolation, less stress due to employment. You don't even have to worry anymore about housing yourself or feeding yourself, right? So it's like there's a lot of anxiety that is taken out of your life that may actually bring you to do antisocial behavior. And I always felt like that could be a bit like copy, but it does make sense, and I feel like it might not like convince everyone because of the fact that it's like saying, well, there will basically be no more crime except for people do crime or passion or whatever. But one thing that helped me is for example, is not believe. I don't know how you feel about that at all. I don't know. I haven't seen you talk about it in a video, and maybe you have, and I just haven't seen it or don't remember it. Is the inexistence of free will, which I believe like is a very strong anarchist thing. And I don't remember who I've read. I think it was Bakunin who said like free will. I don't remember at all. Maybe not Bakunin because he's anti-theist, but like I remember reading an anarchist, one of those old anarchists, the fathers, let's say, who are like, free will is important because that's where humanity gets their freedom. It's through the freedom. But I don't believe in free will. And then there's some other anarchists who say like, no, we are a product of our material conditions. And I feel like if you understand that, I don't know what your position on it is, but I believe that we don't have any free will. That everything's
I don't believe in free will.
There you go. Perfect.
I'm a physicalist or a materialist, however you want to say it. I believe the universe is only a series of causes and effects. So there's really no room for free will in that.
Do you think that informs your anarchism in any way, or is it just circumstantial? Yeah. How?
Yeah, it does.
That's something that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I think it does. Because it changes what is meant by freedom and what's meant by agency, right? Yeah. Like, what is freedom and what is agency when there is no free will? Well, for me, the way I look at it is this. Okay, this is the example that I've used to describe freedom to numerous people. And this is actually really similar to how physicists use the word freedom, because they actually have there is a technical term in physics, and it's called degrees of freedom. So this word freedom actually does have some scientific meaning insofar as it, we're looking for that. But the idea is this, okay? Freedom is the real capability to choose things. It is your range of things you could choose between. And often people will be like, well, you don't have a range of things you can choose between. You're only ever going to choose one thing. Yes, indeed, absolutely true. You will only ever choose one thing. But much as, say, a car has like a turning radius, okay? Well, the car can only choose, it will only choose one angle, but the angle it has available to it differs, right? Depending on the kind of car and the way that car is built. So the car could have a very sharp turning radius, it could have a very wide turning radius, but that turning radius constrains its range of possible choices, right? Yeah, but ultimately, it'll only ever choose one when it turns that corner. It couldn't, quote unquote, choose otherwise in that sense. It just has a range of options to choose from. And if you constrain that range of options, it is able to overcome fewer hurdles, right? Like if my car has a really, really wide turn radius, like if it becomes too wide, I can't turn corners anymore. Yeah, I only choose one angle, but it doesn't matter what angle I choose. I can't turn the corner. It's too wide. I'm trying to get a semi truck on, up a driveway or something, it's just not going to happen. So what is freedom to the anarchist? Well, it pretty much exactly matches what the anarchist says. Freedom is a positive notion. It is the embodied ability to choose and to act, right? So it is the range of possible things. Bookchin has a way of talking about what he calls potentialities and actualities. So for Bookchin, freedom is the ability to bring potentials into reality. Okay, so everything has a range of potentials, and that is not infinite, right? I don't have the capability to fly. That's just not within the range of possibilities to me. Therefore, even though, yes, I will only ever choose one path, it was never an available path that I could fly. The only available paths to me are the paths, walking. I can walk to a car and use a car. I could walk to an airplane and the airplane can fly, but I cannot fly. I don't have wings, right? So it is not within my range of freedom to lift off from the ground with my wings. So it's not within my range of potentials, as Bookchin would say. Now, if I were to broaden that out, what is my actual freedom to go from one area to another by way of flying? Yeah, I can get on an airplane. And if I have access to airplanes, I now have the freedom to fly, right? That freedom is there. But of course, it's embodied through my interaction with another object, and that's the interaction with the plane. So the plane expands my range of potentials. And it also expands what potentials I can bring into actuality. And so for the anarchist, for Bookchin, for everybody that's in that particular, way of thought, that access to the plane expands my freedom. That is an example of my freedom being expanded. Okay, so then this also makes sense of why the anarchists always say that freedom is expanded through solidarity. This is not just like abstraction. This isn't just like fancy sounding words being strung together. Like it really has a concrete meaning here, right? Like my coordination and cooperation with other people, solidarity, allows me to really truly do things, not in an abstract ideal sense, but in a real sense, right? Like right now, for example, this mic, okay? This mic, because this mic is here and it was produced by a series of people, and this plastic was produced in some place, and this little muff thing was produced in some place, and the arm it's on, okay, that was produced in some place, and so on. Now I have to put it back on the thing. I screwed it up. Anyway, but like that expanded my range of potentials to include this actuality. Here I am sitting in front of you, talking to the camera, talking through this mic. Okay. And my coordination with all these people who made all these objects that I'm surrounded with has expanded my freedom in the process. And that is, to me, the physicalist or materialist understanding of this word freedom. And it gives meaning to these impulses of cooperation and solidarity and so on. And I don't need radical free will, the ability to have, quote unquote, chosen otherwise. Everything is cause and effect, but there are ranges of potentials for things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. It's interesting because I haven't seen it that way at all. Like my materials version of like free will and anarchism don't intersect the way they do with you. For me, it's like the way I see it is, especially in terms of crime, because like Jasper answered, by the way, he said therapy and rehab is almost always the best solution to reducing crime and stopping reoffending. But it's not just therapy and rehab. It's also taking the causes of crime. And the way I see it, and I might see it as well, like it might like tie in with a utilitarian approach. It's like, if you don't believe in free will, as we both don't, we believe that people are a product of their are strictly a product of their material and like social conditions, right? And therefore, we can't put the whole pressure of people to like use their free will to get better themselves. The only way to get people better, and therefore make myself like, it's like, that's the, like, that might be an egoist point that they might not like, but like in terms of like, if I want to be able to make the best decisions within that range that I have, I need to have the best kind of conditions available to me, because those conditions inform my decisions. And the best way to make these conditions like better is by making sure that everybody else's conditions are also better, because that will inform their choice. Because if you say, all right, well, we'll just let it to everybody's free will to make the right choices that will like no without a doubt impact me, because everybody, like, we're all interconnected. If we leave it up to free will, I feel like we're ignoring, or we're giving too much credence to something that doesn't exist. If we accept the fact that material conditions and social conditions inform people's interactions with you and with society as a broader whole, you gotta say, all right, we gotta improve those conditions as soon as possible, because that's what's informing society. And that's how I see like free will. I feel like if you don't believe in free will, you gotta put your whole focus on creating the perfect, maybe not the perfect, but the optimal conditions. Yeah, that will inform the optimal choices for everyone, and that will make, and the more people make better choices and better, interactions with society, well, the better conditions which begets better, decisions, which creates better conditions, which creates better decisions, better conditions. And I feel like it's a great virtuous circle that you can fall into if you don't believe in free will. As if when you do, and I feel like our whole society is based on the whole idea that exists, we're like, all right, we're laying it up to people. If you live in bad conditions, well, use your free will to make the right decisions and get out of those bad conditions. And that's how I see it. And I know a couple of people who don't believe in free will, but are not necessarily leftist. But I feel like not believing in free will leads you to a leftist perspective. Like I have a hard time believing that it doesn't, I don't know. I feel
the same way. Like a lot of people who have talked about, once you get rid of free will, like punishment becomes really specious. Like, it's like, well, but it's not like they could have like chosen otherwise. So like, what's the point of punishment? Like, and then studies also show that people don't even make decisions based on threat of punishment most of the time. Yeah. So it's like, I definitely think it leads to a viewpoint where it's just like, oh, we should be trying to create conditions such that outcomes are different. Oh,
yeah. Also, it undermines the whole idea or the myth of meritocracy.
Yeah.
Because how can you merit something if you couldn't have done otherwise, right?
Right.
And also I feel like it takes away the whole idea, like, for example, inventors, like it takes away that kind of that myth, or that that prestige about being so smart, or about inventing something, or about doing whatever, because, well, you couldn't really have done otherwise. The conditions brought you to invent X thing, which is great. Like, we're very happy and you put a lot of work in it, but like, if we don't believe in free will, you couldn't have done otherwise anyway, right?
Yeah. It also blurs the line between willful action and luck, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's like, I don't know. It's a very interesting thing. I feel like it's a field that's, to me, like, it's kind of obvious that there is no free will, and it's something that people don't usually think about because it's very abstract. But I do think it has a radical potential, the same radical potential as like the disbelief in God, in a way, like the disbelief in God had on societies. I feel like, because a lot of what we assume to be the case relies, just our whole justice system relies on the existence of free will. I think there was like a ruling of a US court saying that we have to believe in free will. If we don't, like, it crumbles the whole point of what we're doing here. So we don't have a choice to believe in free will, and it's true. Like, what's the like I don't know. I find that super interesting, and I feel like I don't know if it's going to be like the hot topic. Oh, let's stop believing in free will. It's like it's a belief even more ingrained than the belief in God for a lot of people, right?
Oh yeah, no, I've had very extensive conversations with people on all sides of this debate many times over the years. This is it's one where it's very disruptive. Like, people have very strong opinions a lot of the time, and if they believe in free will and you tell them they don't, they often get very upset.
That's a meltdown.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I need to leave here in the next 10-ish minutes, probably.
Yeah, well, I was gonna put it like it's almost 10, and I'm pretty tired. If you don't mind, like, it's a discussion I really love, free will. I would be happy to end it on that. Like, yeah, and like I don't want to say like that it's never going to be like an actual good question. Like, eventually, because like people didn't believe that rethinking God was actually a good, like, would ever happen, right? Who would doubt God one day? It would be impossible. And now, like, atheism is becoming more and more prevalent. So maybe free will will become.
We'll see.
A lot of, yeah. I don't know. Yeah, maybe we'll see it'll take a while. Maybe yeah, I don't know. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It was really, really fascinating. I hope we can do this again. I think a lot of people enjoyed it. And I saw a lot of people in chat that I never saw before, and I imagine it might be from your audience. And I'll make the segment of this interview. I'll put it on my second channel, and if you want it as well, I can send it to you, and you can post it.
Yeah, that'd be good. I'll probably post it on my channel as well.
Amazing. Yeah, no, it's a great conversation. If you want to do it again, just message me. I'm always up to like, people enjoy it. Like, people are really looking forward to this. I'm very happy to see that it happened first, because I already tried to schedule like interviews like this before, and it didn't really work out because people, like, had other things. But like, I'm happy that this one worked and it went super well. And I mean, there's a lot to talk about. So I'm sure, like, if you're coming out, we're not going to run out of topics.
No, we could have done this for a lot longer if we weren't getting tired. So
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I hopefully see you again in, like, not too long of a while.
Give it a few weeks at least.
Yeah, exactly. Gotta make it a bit how do you say it? Rare, right? We gotta create.
There we go. Yes. Yeah. There we go. A little bit impose some artificial scarcity.
Exactly. Got scarcity for the twins.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for having me on. I'll talk with you soon.
Thank you. Have a nice night, nice evening.
Yes, indeed. See you later.
Goodbye.